Welcome to Terrified Tales, where things are about to get unsettling. Before we dive deeper into the darkness, make sure to like and subscribe. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you brave enough to be here at night? Now, relax and let the fear take hold. Story 1. Michael stood at the edge of the Chugach Mountains, staring up at the towering snow-capped peaks that loomed over the forested valleys. He was alone, just the way he liked it. A seasoned hiker, Michael relished the solitude of the Alaskan wilderness, a place where the noise of the world couldn't reach him, where he could strip away the distractions of modern life and get back to something real. His backpack was heavy but well-balanced, containing everything he needed for a 3-day trek along the rugged trail he had been eyeing for months. The sky was already beginning to shift, dark clouds gathering like a brewing storm in the distance. Michael wasn't concerned. He had been through storms before, knew how to read the weather, and he'd been hiking these mountains for years. A storm rolling in. It was just part of the challenge, part of what made the mountains so raw and beautiful. He'd started early in the morning, with plenty of time to make camp before the worst of it hit. By the time the storm got bad, he'd have found shelter. As he continued along the trail, the wind began to pick up, whispering through the trees and sending the first few raindrops scattering across his face. The air smelled rich, earthy, damp, the scent of the forest after a good rain. It was refreshing, almost soothing, but Michael couldn't shake the sense that something was off. The storm had come in quickly, much faster than he had expected. It was supposed to stay clear for a few more hours. Still, he pushed the uneasy thought aside and focused on his pace. The trail ahead was muddy, and with each step, the soles of his boots sank into the soft earth, leaving deep impressions in the thick, wet ground. The path curved through dense forest, trees towering above him like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with rain. The once crisp, dry air had become saturated with moisture, and the wind carried the distant rumble of thunder. It was strange to be so alone in the vast expanse. But Michael felt no fear. The wild had always been his home, his sanctuary. The first drops of heavy rain began to fall in earnest, the kind of rain that soaks you to the skin in a matter of minutes. Michael reached for his jacket, pulling it tight around him as he quickened his pace, eager to find cover. The trail narrowed ahead, winding between thick spruce trees and jagged rocks. But his eyes were drawn to the ground. Something was off. There, in the mud, were footprints, not his own, barefoot prints, deep, fresh, and very clearly not his. They were heavy impressions, the kind of marks left by someone walking with purpose. The rain hadn't yet washed them away, and they were perfectly outlined against the dark, glistening earth. His first thought was that someone had passed this way recently, maybe even recently enough to leave prints in the muddy path. But the more he looked, the more uneasy he became. There was something about them, how deep the prints were, how fresh, how far they stretched. He knelt down, pressing his fingers into the mud, feeling the warm dampness of the earth still holding the shape. This wasn't just an accident. Whoever had been here was moving, fast, purposeful, and the bare feet made no sense to him. Why would someone be hiking in the mountains, barefoot, in the middle of a storm? His first instinct was to shout out, to call to whoever might be ahead, but the wind had picked up, howling through the trees. It would be impossible to hear anything over the storm now. So he decided to follow the tracks. Surely someone was lost. It wasn't uncommon in remote parts of the Chugach Mountains for hikers to stray off course or get caught in the weather. But this felt different. The more he thought about it, the more unnerving the idea became. A person, barefoot in this storm. Who would do that? He stood up slowly, adjusting his pack, and then began walking forward, his eyes scanning the muddy path, following the deep impressions in the ground. The trail ahead was becoming muddier with every step. The rain falling in sheets now, a cold torrent that made everything feel slick and slippery. The wind howled louder, pushing the rain sideways, and the trees above groaned in response. The sounds of the wilderness were muffled by the storm, but in that quiet, there was something unsettling about the deep silence around him. It was as if the storm itself was trying to swallow the forest, consuming everything in its path. Michael's eyes narrowed as he saw the footprints stretch further ahead. They were clear, too clear. How was it that in this downpour, with the storm picking up intensity, the prints hadn't begun to fade already? They were fresh, almost too fresh, as if whoever had made them had just passed moments before he arrived. His heart beat faster in his chest, the pace of his footsteps quickening as he pressed on, a gnawing feeling of unease settling deep in his stomach. Was someone hurt? Had they been running from something? The trail began to narrow even more as the path curled around a bend, climbing higher into the mountains. The trees grew thicker, their trunks twisted and weathered by the storms that had passed through over the years. The air felt heavier now, thicker with the weight of the storm, and every gust of wind carried with it the scent of the sea, as though the mountains themselves were reaching out for something far beyond the shore. And then, just ahead, the footprints disappeared. In the middle of the trail, right where the mud seemed to have swallowed them whole. There was nothing, no sign of anyone, no hint of another person ahead. Michael stood frozen for a moment, the storm still hammering the earth around him. He knelt again, running his fingers over the ground, searching for any sign of where the person had gone. But the trail simply stopped. A sharp pang of dread struck him. How could the tracks just vanish? He checked his GPS, hoping that it might offer some insight. But when he glanced at the screen, his blood ran cold. He had been hiking off course, not by a few yards, but by miles. The trail he had been following wasn't the one he thought it was. He wasn't where he thought he was. He was deeper into the wilderness than he should have been, further away from any markers or known routes. How could that be? He hadn't left the trail. Panic gripped him as he realized how far off the trail he had wandered. He had never left the path, hadn't taken a wrong turn, hadn't lost his way. But here he was, alone, deep in the wilderness, further from safety than he had intended. And there was still no one in sight, no sign of a lost hiker. Only the deafening storm, and the growing sense of dread clawing at the back of his mind. Suddenly, a loud crash of thunder shattered the air above, and the ground beneath him trembled. A shiver crawled up his spine. The squelching sound of footsteps, wet and heavy, echoed behind him. He spun around, his heart in his throat, but there was nothing there. Just the wind, just the rain, and the empty trail ahead. Michael stood frozen for a moment, his pulse pounding in his ears as the squelching footsteps echoed in his mind. He strained his eyes, trying to pierce the gloom of the storm, but all he could see was the dense wall of rain and mist, swirling around him like a living entity. The forest was eerily quiet now, save for the constant rhythm of the rain and the occasional rumble of thunder in the distance. The footsteps were gone, but they hadn't been a trick of the mind. They were too real, too present. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. Get a grip, he told himself. It was just the storm playing tricks on him. The wind howling through the trees, the rain splattering against the ground, all of it. He had been out here enough times to know that his senses could betray him. His mind, a mixture of exhaustion and adrenaline, had likely conjured the sound of footsteps where there were none. He turned back to the trail, trying to calm himself, but that feeling, an unsettling tug in his gut, refused to fade. The footprints ahead of him had stopped abruptly, as if someone had simply vanished into thin air. He ran his fingers over the mud again, the wet earth clinging to his skin as if trying to hold him in place. The trail was undisturbed beyond the point where the bare footprints ended. No marks on the ground. No trace of the person who had been walking ahead of him. His eyes flickered back to the GPS, the small screen showing the unfamiliar terrain ahead. His heart skipped a beat when he saw that his route was far more off course than he'd expected. How had he gotten this far out? Hadn't he been following the marked path? Panic twisted in his chest again, tightening like a vice, but he didn't want to believe it. He glanced over his shoulder one last time, half expecting to see someone there, someone coming up behind him. But the trail was still empty. The storm raged on, and the rain fell harder now, soaking his jacket, his clothes, his boots, the weight of it all pressing against him like a wall. Shaking his head, he snapped the GPS back into place and sighed. "It's just the storm," he repeated. But something gnawed at him, an insistent itch that told him it wasn't just the storm. There was something else, something off about this. The barefoot tracks, the sudden, inexplicable disappearance of the trail, the footsteps he had heard. He had to find out what happened, find out where the person had gone. There was no way he could leave a fellow hiker out here in this weather. Maybe someone had gotten lost. Maybe they had wandered off the trail in search of shelter. But whatever it was, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn into something more. He had to follow the tracks. He had to see it through. With a determined breath, Michael pushed forward again, focusing on the trail ahead, hoping for answers, hoping that the person, whoever they were, was just around the next bend. The rain had washed over the trail again, smoothing out some of the muddier sections, but the barefoot prints were still there, faint but unmistakable, leading him deeper into the wilderness. As he walked, the landscape around him shifted. The trees grew thicker, their bark gnarled and twisted, blocking out more of the light from the fading sky. The air seemed to grow colder, heavier, pressing down on him. The feeling of isolation, something he usually reveled in, was starting to feel more like a weight, a suffocating presence. His pace quickened as he followed the trail, his eyes glued to the ground, tracing the edges of the muddy prints. His mind wandered, thoughts flickering between concerns. Where had this person gone? How had they disappeared so suddenly? Another roll of thunder split the sky. The storm seemed to be growing, intensifying as the path climbed higher into the mountains. It wasn't just rain anymore. The wind had picked up, snapping through the trees like an angry beast. Branches creaked under the strain of the gusts, and the distant roar of the river somewhere far below echoed through the mountain passes. Michael pulled his hood tighter around his face, shielding himself from the sheets of rain that began to fall in torrents. He was far enough now that the trail was less defined, more rugged. His boots slipped on the wet rocks, and the steep incline of the mountainside forced him to focus on his footing. Still, he pressed forward. The trail had to continue somewhere. The tracks, too, would lead him to something, someone. Minutes passed, and the trail grew harder to follow, the footprints less defined. The storm was too much now, the rain battering his face, the wind howling in his ears. But then, just as he was beginning to question how much further he should go, he saw it. A small clearing ahead, barely visible through the mist and rain. And standing at the edge of the clearing, a figure, a person, standing still, facing away from him, as if waiting for something. The figure's body was outlined in the mist, but their face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, their back turned. It was the same size, the same form. It had to be the person who had left the footprints. "Hey!" Michael shouted, his voice barely carrying over the storm. The figure didn't turn. "Hey, are you okay?" He took a step forward, and then another, his legs heavy, his feet sinking into the wet earth. The figure stood motionless, unmoving. Something about them sent a chill through his spine. Why didn't they move? Michael's thoughts raced. It was too strange, too still. Another step, and then In an instant, the figure turned, and Michael's heart slammed in his chest. There was no face, no eyes, no features, just empty darkness. The void in the figure's face stared back at him, empty, endless. For a heartbeat, Michael stood frozen, his legs refusing to move, his chest tightening in fear. It was as though the figure was not just a person, but a hole, a void in the storm itself, filled with nothingness. And just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, dissolving into the mist. Michael's breath came in ragged gasps. His heart pounded, but he couldn't move. The figure was gone. The clearing was empty. The storm raged on. Suddenly, the squelching of footprints returned, this time closer, right behind him. Michael's heart skipped a beat, the pounding in his chest drowning out the roar of the storm. His breath came in quick, shallow gasps, and for a moment, he couldn't move. He stood frozen in the clearing, his eyes darting around, scanning every inch of the landscape. The figure, whatever it had been, was gone, vanished into the mist, leaving behind only the sound of the wind and the incessant fall of rain. But the squelching footsteps, those unmistakable sounds of someone or something moving behind him, hadn't stopped. They were closer now, too close. Michael's body tensed as he slowly turned around, his feet sinking deeper into the mud. His pulse thundered in his ears as he glanced over his shoulder, his breath caught in his throat. Nothing. The trail behind him was empty. The footsteps had vanished as soon as he turned, as if they had never been there at all. His mind raced to process what was happening. The figure, the tracks, the strange feeling of being watched. It all felt so wrong. He had followed the trail so carefully. The barefoot prints had been clear, deep, unmistakable. But now there was nothing. No sign of a person, no footsteps, no tracks. It was as if the trail itself had simply disappeared. Michael looked down at the ground beneath him, hoping to see any clue, anything that would explain what was happening. He found only the same muddy earth, his own tracks blending into the endless mud. The rain continued to pour down, the wet earth shifting beneath his boots, but there was no evidence of the person who had been here moments ago. The bear prints had vanished entirely. He moved forward slowly, cautiously, scanning the ground for any indication of where the trail might have gone. His heart was still racing, each beat echoing in his chest, but his eyes remained locked on the ground. He needed to find answers. There had to be something, some clue to explain it all. He paused, crouching down, his hand hovering over the spot where the prints had stopped. The mud was fresh here, still glistening with rain, but there were no new marks. The trail had ended abruptly, as if the person had simply ceased to exist. He couldn't understand it. A person couldn't just vanish like that, could they? His gaze lifted slowly, moving over the landscape around him. The forest stood still, silent. The wind whispered through the trees, the only sound besides the storm, but everything felt wrong, too quiet. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the complete lack of anything moving, anything alive, beyond the relentless battering of the storm. Michael stood up, taking a step back, unsure of what to do. Was he imagining things? Had he been out here for too long? Was the isolation messing with his mind? But no, this was real. He had heard those footsteps. He had seen the figure. The footprints had been there, and they had disappeared. He reached for his GPS again, hoping for some sense of direction, some kind of sign that he hadn't wandered too far from the trail. But when he glanced down at the screen, his stomach dropped. The device flickered and blinked erratically, the map spinning in circles, showing no clear path ahead. The screen went blank for a moment before it returned, but now it showed him miles off course, far from any recognizable route. How could that be? He hadn't left the trail. He hadn't turned or veered off the path in any way. His thoughts spiraled, confusion clouding his mind. Was he lost? How had this happened? The squelching footsteps came again, this time louder, unmistakable. The sound of wet shoes pressing against the mud. Michael's head snapped up, his body frozen in place. He wasn't alone. He turned slowly, dread pooling in his stomach. His heart hammered in his chest, each beat a drum in the quiet of the storm. But again, when he scanned the trail behind him, there was nothing. No one was there. The path was empty. The rain kept falling in sheets, the wind howling above. But Michael could feel it now, a presence, like a shadow creeping along his every step. Someone, or something, was out there, following him. He had heard the footsteps, felt the weight of the presence behind him. But there was no one. No sign of anyone else. The dread was thick in the air now, heavy, suffocating. He could feel the weight of it pressing on his chest, urging him to turn around and run. But the thought of running, of moving without knowing where to go, only made his fear worse. He had to figure this out. He couldn't let himself panic. Not yet. But the longer he stood there, the more he felt the storm closing in, the more oppressive the silence grew. He wanted to scream, to shout for help, but his throat was dry, his voice a distant echo, swallowed by the storm. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath him. The forest around him seemed to shake as though something had moved, something large, something powerful. The trees groaned, their trunks bending unnaturally in the wind, their roots shifting in the earth, as if the very land was alive, reacting to something unseen. It can't be real. This can't be happening. He stumbled backward, his heart racing, as his mind struggled to keep up with the mounting terror. The footsteps, the figure, the GPS. It all felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. And then, as he turned to look down the path, a movement caught his eye. Just at the edge of the trees, the barest flicker of motion, someone or something standing in the shadows. His breath caught in his throat. He could barely make out the outline of a person, their body obscured by the mist and rain, but the shape was unmistakable. They were standing completely still, watching him. The footsteps had led him here, to this moment. And now, something or someone was waiting. The figure in the trees stood motionless, a dark silhouette against the storm-battered backdrop of the forest. Michael's breath hitched in his throat. His legs felt like they were made of stone, refusing to move, refusing to carry him toward whatever this figure was. The wind howled around him, the rain beating relentlessly against his face. But all of that seemed to fade as his eyes remained fixed on the dark shape in the mist. He couldn't make out any clear features, just a vague, human-like form standing in the shadows of the trees. The figure was tall, almost unnaturally so, its outlines swaying gently with the movement of the wind. The more Michael stared, the more it seemed to melt into the trees, like a part of the wilderness itself, like it wasn't quite real. For a brief moment, the world seemed to go completely silent, as though the storm itself had momentarily paused to listen. Then, the wind picked up again, and the rain pelted down harder, but Michael still couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure. It hadn't moved since he'd seen it. It just stood there, as if waiting. He swallowed hard, the knot in his stomach tightening. The chill in the air seemed to seep into his bones. What was he supposed to do? Should he call out, try to ask if the person needed help? Or was this just another trick of his mind, some weird side effect of being out in the wild for too long? And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure moved. It wasn't a slow, deliberate movement, but a sudden, jerking motion, like a string being pulled taut. In the blink of an eye, the shape stepped back into the trees, vanishing into the shadows, disappearing as if it had never been there. Michael blinked, momentarily stunned, and then scrambled forward, his heart pounding. Had it been a person? Was someone out here with him, a fellow hiker? Or was this something else, something that wasn't supposed to be here? He couldn't just stand there frozen anymore. Panic began to creep in, a slow, insidious dread that made every muscle in his body twitch with unease. Stay calm. Focus. There had to be an explanation. But no matter how hard he tried to reason with himself, that horrible feeling, the one that told him something wasn't right, remained. He took a step forward cautiously, trying to peer through the mist to see if he could spot the figure again. But the forest was too thick, the trees too tightly packed. It was impossible to see anything beyond a few yards. Don't go after it. Just stay on the trail. That's what he told himself. But the impulse to follow the figure, to find out who or what it was overwhelming. The curiosity gnawed at him. He couldn't let it go. The footsteps, those strange barefoot prints, had led him here to this moment, to this strange, unsettling encounter. His mind raced, and he glanced back down the trail, hoping to find some kind of comfort in the familiar path. But the trail had changed in ways he couldn't understand. The trees were thicker here. The path seemed steeper, the ground muddier, as though the storm had left its mark more heavily here than anywhere else. He was sure he hadn't wandered off course. But somehow, the place felt different, like he had crossed some invisible line into territory that wasn't his own, and then the strangest thing happened. He heard it again, those same squelching footsteps, unmistakable, echoing from behind. Him. But this time, they weren't behind him. They were in front of him, and they were growing louder. His breath caught in his throat. The sound was coming from the trail, from the direction he had just come. It was as if the footsteps were following him, closing the distance between them with every passing second. He spun around, heart hammering in his chest, but the path was empty. There was no one there. Hello? His voice broke through the storm, barely audible over the howling wind, but he didn't expect an answer. There was nothing but the sound of the rain and the crashing thunder. His throat was tight with fear. Was he imagining this? Had the isolation and the storm begun to unravel his mind? He took a deep breath and began walking faster, his steps quicker now, his boots slapping the mud with each stride. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, like someone or something was just out of sight, waiting for him to slip, to falter. It was as if the forest itself had become a trap, and he was the prey. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and for the first time in his life, the wilderness didn't feel like home. The sound of the footsteps grew louder again, and Michael's heartbeat picked up. Don't look back. He couldn't stop himself from glancing over his shoulder, but the path behind him was still empty. The rain, the wind, it all felt like the world closing in on him, and the sense of being followed was unbearable. He picked up his pace, his legs burning as he moved, but then, crunch. A twig snapped behind him. A soft, deliberate sound like someone stepping lightly on the forest floor, trying to remain quiet but failing. The sound was unmistakable. Someone or something was following him. He spun around so quickly, his feet slipping in the mud, and then nothing. The trail was empty again. The forest around him was silent, the rain falling steadily, the storm roaring above. But the footprints, those damn footprints, seemed to be growing closer, more urgent, as though something was stalking him through the woods. He couldn't take it anymore. His instinct screamed at him to turn back, to retrace his steps, but he had no idea where to go. The storm had swallowed the landscape. The path was no longer clear, the map useless in his hands. He had to keep moving. But every step felt like a mistake. And with every step, the feeling of being followed grew stronger. The footsteps were closer now, and then he heard it again. This time, it was a whisper. It was coming from the trees, from the very air around him. Help me. His blood turned to ice. He wasn't alone. Michael stood still, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath ragged and quick. The voice, faint yet unmistakable, had come from somewhere deep in the trees, closer than the wind, sharper than the rain. He swallowed hard, the words echoing in his mind like a terrible mantra. Help me. It wasn't possible. He had to be imagining it. No one could be out here in the storm, in the middle of this unforgiving wilderness. And yet, there was no denying what he had heard. He glanced around, frantically trying to pinpoint the source of the voice, but the rain was so thick now that it seemed to veil everything in a damp, suffocating mist. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their branches whipping in the wind. His feet were sinking into the mud with each step, the ground sucking at him like a living thing. The feeling of being watched, of something, or someone, just out of sight, was overwhelming. "Hello?" Michael called out, his voice sounding weak, swallowed by the storm. His words barely made it past the rain. He didn't expect a reply, but he had to ask. He had to know if there was someone else here, someone who might be in danger. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind of stillness that made his skin prickle, his body tense, ready to flee at any second. He could feel the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. His senses screamed that something wasn't right. He wasn't alone, and it wasn't just the storm that made him feel so small, so vulnerable. The mud squelched beneath his boots as he took a hesitant step forward, eyes darting around him, searching the thick wall of trees and mist for any movement. His breath fogged in front of him as he exhaled, and he realized his hands were trembling. Then, from the corner of his eye, something caught his attention, a flash of white. A figure, no, a shape, barely visible through the swirling mist. It was too quick, too fleeting for him to catch its full form, but it was enough. Michael's heart skipped a beat, his eyes snapping toward the direction it had appeared from, but there was nothing, no person, no movement, only the rain, falling harder now, and the deafening roar of the wind. A cold shiver ran down his spine. What the hell is happening? He forced himself to move forward again, pushing through the creeping sense of dread that had settled in his chest like a heavy stone. His instincts told him to run, to turn around, forget the strange footprints, forget the figure in the mist, forget everything, and head back to safety. But he couldn't. Something. Maybe it was the same impulse that had driven him to follow. The footprints, or perhaps it was the pull of the unknown, kept him moving. He had to know what was out there. He had to know if there was someone else in need of help, or if something more sinister was lurking in the wilderness, waiting for him to make the wrong move. As Michael trudged deeper into the storm, the world around him seemed to warp. The trees were no longer just trees. They were towering, twisted shapes, their trunks impossibly gnarled, reaching out like hands, their branches clawing at the sky. The air felt thicker now, heavier with a weight. That wasn't just the storm. It felt like the earth itself was watching him, waiting for him to step off course, to wander into its domain. He gritted his teeth and forced himself to keep moving, trying to ignore the growing sense of wrongness. He kept his eyes on the path. Ahead, each step forward, feeling like a battle against an unseen force, an invisible hand that seemed to push him into the unknown. Then, the footsteps returned. This time, they weren't behind him. They weren't beside him. They were directly in front of him. Michael froze. His breath caught in his throat. The squelching footsteps, the ones that had echoed through the mud earlier, were now unmistakable, heavy, deliberate, like someone was walking just a few feet ahead of him. He could hear them clearly through the deafening storm. But no one is there. He stood motionless, his eyes wide, scanning the trail ahead. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, each squelch a steady rhythm that seemed to match the pounding of his own heart. But there was no one. The trail was empty. There was no person walking ahead of him. No movement. Michael's mind raced. The fear began to bubble up in his chest. a rising tide that threatened to overwhelm him. He couldn't explain it. He couldn't justify it. Who, what, was out there? In an instant, the footsteps stopped, and for a long, breathless moment, there was nothing but the storm, the wind, and the oppressive silence that seemed to hang in the air like a dense fog. The forest held its breath, and so did Michael. His pulse quickened, his chest tightening with an almost physical ache as his mind scrambled to process what was happening. Then, the wind shifted. The rain, which had been coming down in a torrential deluge, began to lessen. The sound of it changed, becoming a quiet pattering, like water dripping from the leaves. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the world seemed to fall into a stillness that was almost unnatural. And then, the figure appeared again. But this time, it wasn't in the mist. It wasn't hidden by the rain. It was standing directly in front of him, just past the next bend in the trail, blocking his way. Michael stopped in his tracks, his legs feeling like lead. He didn't know whether to move toward the figure or turn, around and run. The figure stood there, unmoving just like it had before. Only this time, Michael could see it more clearly. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, and thin, its body draped in tattered, dark clothing that blended into the shadowy forest behind it. But what caught his attention most was the face, or rather the lack of one. The figure's face was a blank canvas, an empty space where a face should be. There were no eyes, no mouth, no nose, just a smooth, pale surface. A perfect, unbroken mask of skin that reflected no light, no shadows. Michael's throat went dry, his body frozen in place. His mind was screaming at him to run, to escape, to get as far away from this thing as possible. But his feet refused to move, his body locked in place, his eyes locked on that faceless, motionless shape ahead of him. The figure did not speak. It did not move. It only stood there, watching. The rain hadn't stopped. In fact, it seemed to be intensifying with each passing minute. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees, shaking the branches as if they were being forced into submission by some unseen force. Michael had been moving for hours, his mind consumed with the image of the faceless figure standing before him on the trail. His body had grown exhausted, his limbs sore from the relentless pace he had set, but his fear kept him moving, even when every instinct in him screamed to turn back. Finally, he had come to a small clearing and made camp, setting up his tent in the ever-darkening gloom. The sky had turned a deep slate color, and there was no sign of the storm letting up any time soon. His hands trembled as he worked quickly, the noise of the rain against the fabric of his tent only adding to his sense of urgency. The wind had picked up, tugging at the sides of the tent, pushing it toward the earth as if the forest itself wanted to swallow him whole. Inside the tent, Michael zipped it shut and leaned against the side, his breath shallow and quick. His heart still raced from the encounter, and his thoughts kept circling back to that figure in the woods. That blank, faceless thing. What had it been? And why had it been there? It couldn't have been human. No person could stand in the rain like that, unmoving, their face, their entire face, blank. A smooth, unmarked surface. Was I seeing things? Michael wondered, trying to push away the doubt that threatened to overwhelm him. But the feeling of being watched, the relentless sensation of eyes on him, unseen, but always present, never left him. He couldn't shake it. Outside the tent, the storm raged on. The wind screamed through the trees, the rain beating harder against the fabric, a constant drumming rhythm. The sounds of the wilderness had changed. The forest had gone quiet, except for the storm, and even the wind felt unnatural. The trees had begun to groan, their limbs straining as if under some invisible weight. Michael sat down in his sleeping bag, trying to focus on the warmth it provided, trying to forget the darkness outside the tent. The night pressed in around him like a suffocating blanket, and he forced his eyes shut, hoping for rest. But sleep wouldn't come. The wind kept howling. The storm kept raging. But something else was there. Something that didn't belong. He could feel it. A presence. Right outside his tent, something, or someone, was moving around him. Michael's eyes snapped open. At first he thought it was the wind again, the rain falling so heavily it was impossible to tell the difference. But then the sound came again, soft, slow footsteps, as if someone was walking around the edge of his camp. The squelch of bare feet in the wet mud. They were deliberate, slow, as if the person or thing knew he was inside, knew he was listening. He held his breath, the sound of the footsteps unmistakable, coming from just outside his tent. The rain pounded down, the wind howled, but the footsteps were clear, distinct. No. Michael's heart hammered in his chest. There was no one out there. It had to be a trick of the storm. The rain was playing tricks on him, warping the sound of the wind. It had to be. But then the footsteps came again, closer this time. The unmistakable squelch of wet, muddy steps on the earth right next to his tent. Michael's body froze. His pulse pounded in his ears. He should shout out, ask who was out there, demand that they show themselves, but his mouth felt dry. The words stuck in his throat. If it was someone, a hiker who had gotten lost, he should say something, tell them to move on, ask them if they were okay. But if it wasn't someone, if it wasn't a person, the footsteps circled the tent again. He could hear the squelching with every step, as if they were pacing, moving around him, almost waiting. He pulled the edges of his sleeping bag tighter around his body, his chest tight, heart racing, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The footsteps were there, just on the other side of the thin fabric, but they never grew louder. They were moving so deliberately, so calmly, as if they were in no hurry. The sound of the footsteps faded, and the night seemed to fall even deeper into silence. Michael didn't move. He didn't dare. His eyes were wide in the darkness, straining to hear any sound, any movement. And then, a rustling. Something brushing against the tent. Something large, heavy, and deliberate. It wasn't just the wind. No, this was something else. Something moving with intent, scraping against the fabric, brushing the side of the tent with a cold, wet touch. A feeling of complete helplessness washed over Michael. He couldn't leave. He couldn't go out there into the storm. The trail had already twisted in ways that didn't make sense. The footprints, the strange figure, the footsteps outside his tent. This couldn't just be the weather. Something, someone, was out there. The rustling outside stopped. He held his breath, straining to hear the faintest sound. The storm was still roaring, but the presence outside had gone silent, too still. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the footsteps returned. This time, they were right next to the door of the tent. A soft, sloshing sound as bare feet moved through the wet mud, so close that Michael could hear the faint squelch of each step. There was a moment of stillness. Too much stillness. The storm roared, but Michael's mind was fixated on the presence, outside the thing waiting there. Without warning, the footsteps started to move again, but this time they began to circle around the camp, back and forth like someone walking, endlessly pacing the perimeter of his tent. He couldn't stand it anymore. He had to know, had to see if there was someone out there. Slowly, his hand reached for the zipper of his tent. His fingers shook. The thought of exposing himself to whatever or whoever was out there paralyzed him. But he knew he couldn't stay trapped, alone in his tent. The zipper slid open just a fraction, enough to peek through. The storm raged, But there was nothing but the rain. Michael stood at the edge of his tent, the zipper barely open, his heart hammering in his chest. He hadn't dared to open it fully, but the storm outside, the howling wind, the incessant pounding of the rain, had quieted slightly. The only sound now was the steady drip of water from the branches overhead, the forest around him muffled in the thick fog that had settled over the land. His breath came in ragged gasps, his eyes darting nervously across the clearing, hoping against hope that he was imagining things, that the last few hours had all been the result of his own fear, his mind playing tricks on him. He was wrong. The footsteps had returned. From the corner of his eye, he caught the faintest movement. The muddy footprints, once gone, were now clearly visible in the damp earth outside his tent. The same prints. Barefoot, deep, fresh, their shapes unmistakable against the soaked ground. They circled around the edges of his camp, just as they had before. Michael's stomach twisted into a knot. His gaze lingered on the trail, now a loop of dark, wet impressions that led all around the edge of his camp. It was as though whoever or whatever had made them had been walking in a perfect circle around his tent, pacing, waiting. He could feel his breath become shallow, his pulse quickening. The tracks weren't just random, they seemed deliberate, like they were closing in on him. What is this? His thoughts raced, panic seizing him. This wasn't normal, it wasn't possible. The footprints had disappeared earlier, vanished without a trace. How could they reappear like this, and why circle? His camp? There was no logical explanation, no sensible reason for any of it. The prints seemed to beckon him to follow them, to see where they would lead, but he knew better. Every instinct screamed at him to stay inside the tent, to hide, to protect himself from whatever was out there in the wilderness, stalking him in the storm. But something twisted inside him, drove him to peek out of the tent one more time. He unzipped the flap fully, the rain cascading over him in an instant. But even as he stepped outside, the air felt wrong. The wet, earthy scent of the forest was thick with the sharp tang of something else, something metallic, something unnatural. The ground beneath his boots squelched with every step, his feet sinking deeper into the mud, but he couldn't look away from the trail of footprints. They led to the tree line, where the forest seemed darker, even with the faint light that the storm still allowed to filter through the mist. And as Michael stared ahead, he realized that the footprints were no longer just in the mud. They were leading him into the woods. The trees, thick with rain-soaked leaves, blocked his view beyond a few yards, but the tracks seemed to stop just at the edge, as if they had been absorbed by the dark forest. He hesitated, staring into the gloom, feeling the strange pull of the prints. They had to have been made recently. The rain hadn't had time to wash them away. But why hadn't the person, if it was a person, continued on? Why stop here at the threshold of the woods, and then it hit him? The footsteps had stopped at the trees. They hadn't disappeared like the first time. They had paused. Something was waiting there, watching him. His breath caught in his throat, his legs rooted to the spot. He wanted to turn around and retreat back to the safety of his tent, to lock himself inside and pretend that whatever was going on wasn't happening. But the need to understand, to know, compelled him forward. With trembling hands, he took another step. Crunch. A sound, soft but sharp, broke the silence of the storm, and Michael froze. His heart pounded in his ears and a cold sweat beaded on his forehead. The sound had come from deeper in the woods, beyond the tree line where the prints had led. It was like a twig snapping, but it wasn't the kind of noise the wind made. It was deliberate. He glanced around, expecting to see someone emerge from the trees. But there was nothing, no movement. The squelching of the footsteps was gone. The path was empty, and yet Michael's mind raced. The footsteps had to have been real. The tracks, the circles, the figure in the mist. He hadn't imagined any of it, but the silence, the stillness, it was more unnerving than the storm itself. What if it was the storm? What if it was his mind unraveling in isolation, twisting the world around him? But then, from the corner of his eye, he saw something. A flash of movement, no more than a shadow, a blur just at the edge of the trees. He snapped his head toward it, but it was gone, in an instant, as if whatever had been there had disappeared into the mist. "Hello?" His voice barely made it out of his throat. His mouth was dry, his body tense. "Is someone out there?" His words hung in the air for what felt like an eternity. There was no reply. Just the storm, the endless sound of the wind whipping through the branches. He stepped forward again, this time with more purpose. The shadows in the trees seemed to dance with the wind, and every time he looked away, he felt the cold press of something watching him. The muddy trail that circled his camp seemed to pull him toward the woods, and then, just as his foot crossed into the forest, the temperature seemed to drop. The air grew thick, heavier. It was as though the forest itself had absorbed all warmth from the air, leaving only a biting, unnatural cold in its wake. His breath came out in a cloud, a strange condensation that lingered in the air before being swept away by the wind. He took another step, the soft earth beneath his boots squelching. But this time, the mud felt different. It was deeper, darker, like the ground had been waiting for him to walk into it. A deep feeling of dread surged through him, making his chest tighten. I shouldn't be here, but it was too late. He had crossed the threshold, and now the storm, the forest, the voices, they were all closing in. He could feel them, the footsteps, the whispers, and whatever had been following him. It was waiting. Michael stood at the edge of the forest, his body shaking as he took in the dense trees surrounding him. The air was colder now, the weight of the storm pressing in from every direction. He could feel it, the suffocating silence that had settled over the forest, the unsettling absence of sound that was more terrifying than the raging storm. The footprints, those strange barefoot marks, had led him here, into the heart of the wilderness, where the trees towered above him, dark and ancient, as if they held secrets older than the land itself. His feet were heavy like lead as he stood on the muddy trail, every instinct telling him to turn around, to leave, to retreat back to the safety of his tent. But something, the same compulsion that had driven him to follow the tracks, kept him rooted in place. He had to know. He had to understand what was happening, what force had been following him through the storm, circling his camp, whispering in the rain. He felt the weight of the woods pressing in on him, as if the forest itself had become aware of his presence, aware of his trespass. The trees groaned in the wind, their branches swaying like long, bony fingers, reaching toward him. It was as if the very earth around him was alive, watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. The silence that surrounded him was suffocating. The storm outside now a distant memory, drowned by the oppressive stillness of the woods. Michael's breath caught in his throat as his gaze drifted to the ground. The footprints were still there, just ahead of him, leading into the forest, as though someone, or something, had been waiting for him to follow. The rain had softened the edges, but they were still fresh, deep impressions in the mud, clear and undeniable. He looked around again, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with each passing second. "You can turn back now," he told himself. "You don't have to do this." But it was too late. He had already crossed the line. The footprints, the figure, the strange sensation of being followed. He was already tangled in something far bigger than himself. He had to move forward. With each step, the forest seemed to close in on him, the trees tightening around him like walls blocking out the light. The path grew darker, the air thicker, as if the woods were alive, breathing around him. The sound of the wind, once a comforting noise, now seemed hostile, almost mocking in its ferocity. Michael's pulse quickened. His legs felt weak, but he pushed forward, his boots sinking into the soft, wet earth with every step. His eyes never left the trail, the footprints that seemed to beckon him forward into the darkness of the trees. The deeper he went, the more the sensation of being followed grew. He could hear the squelching footsteps behind him again, soft, slow, deliberate. But when he turned around, there was nothing. Just the heavy mist swirling in the shadows and the trees still and silent. His mind raced. What is it? He thought. Who's out there? The footsteps grew louder, closer this time. He could feel the air shift, something moving just behind him. Something that wasn't quite human. It wasn't a person, not anymore. The feeling was undeniable now. The forest wasn't just watching him, it was part of it, alive with it. The woods, the storm, the footsteps, the shadows, they were all connected, feeding off each other, twisting together into something darker than he could comprehend. Suddenly there was a loud crack, the snap of a branch, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush. Michael froze. His heart raced in his chest as he turned toward the sound, expecting to see whatever or whoever had been following him. The forest was empty. The path was quiet. He stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to do. His hands were slick with sweat, his mind spinning, but there was only one thing left to do. He had to keep moving. He had no choice. But just as he took a step forward, something changed. The air grew colder, the mist thicker, as though the world around him had changed in an instant. His breath fogged in front of him as he moved, and then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure, standing just at the edge of the trees, just beyond the path, its outline obscured by the mist. At first, Michael thought it was another trick of his eyes, a shadow cast by the trees, but as he looked closer, his stomach turned. The figure was tall, too tall, its body elongated and unnatural, its limbs twisted, like branches contorted by an unseen force. And its face, it was a mask. No eyes, no mouth, just an empty, smooth surface, reflecting the dim light of the forest, like the blank canvas of something wrong. The figure stood perfectly still, not moving, not making a sound. But it was watching him. He could feel its gaze like fingers creeping over his skin, cold and unrelenting. Michael's blood ran cold. His legs trembled. His mind screamed at him to run, to flee, but his feet felt like they were glued to the ground. The air around him had thickened, become heavy with an oppressive force, and the forest felt like it was closing in, as though the trees, the very earth itself, had become part of the figure, part of the thing standing just outside his reach. And then the figure moved. It was slow at first, a twitch of the limbs, a shift of the body. It took a step toward him. No, not a step. It glided, its feet barely touching the ground, as if it were being pulled by an invisible force. It didn't walk like a human. It moved like something else. Michael's breath caught in his throat. "Run!" his mind screamed, but his legs wouldn't obey. He was paralyzed, unable to move as the figure took another step, and then another. The space between them was closing, and in the stillness of the forest, a whisper filled the air. "Join us." The voice came from all around him, the words not spoken but felt, like a deep, cold echo in his bones. He could hear it in his head, in his chest, in the pit of his stomach. It was the river. It was the forest. It was the storm, the voice of everything that had been stalking him through the woods. The footsteps, the figure, the whispers, they were all part of it. Part of something much older, much darker than anything he had imagined. With a final frantic breath, Michael turned to run, but the earth was already closing in. The path had vanished beneath him. The trees were reaching for him, their branches turning into hands, grasping at his legs, his arms, pulling him toward the shadow. The footsteps, those same squelching, heavy sounds, were right behind him. Closer, louder. And then there was nothing. The forest had swallowed him whole. You're deep into the story now, and the horrors are only escalating. If you're still with us, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Who else is staying up late to face this nightmare? Settle in. The terror continues. Story 2. The rain hit the mountain like a curse, relentless. A dark drumming against the trees, the earth, and everything caught beneath its fury. West Virginia's rivers, renowned for their untamed flow, had turned into surging torrents, transforming from crystal-clear mountain springs into ravenous beasts devouring the land. The sky was a sheet of grey, an oppressive weight pressing down on the wilderness, threatening to swallow the world in its dark belly. Among the shifting trees and constant rattle of rain, 5 figures huddled at the river's edge, hungry for adventure, oblivious to the looming danger. They were seasoned kayakers, a tight-knit group, their bond forged over years of navigating the wild, unpredictable waters of the Appalachian foothills. But this night, the wilderness had a different tone, a restless murmur that none of them could place. The air around them felt thick, too heavy to breathe, and the rain, though constant, fell in a strange rhythm. It was as if the storm had a mind of its own, playing a tune that only the earth could understand. Between bursts of thunder, the group set up their camp, the only source of light their flickering fire that struggled against the wind. The flames danced wildly, casting long, stretching shadows across the uneven ground, as if the forest itself was watching them. John, the eldest of the group, had been kayaking these rivers for over 20 years. His hands were weathered and steady, his face etched with the wisdom of the wild. But tonight his eyes seemed restless, glancing constantly at the churning river. He noticed the strange stillness between the gusts of wind, an unnatural quiet that settled beneath the fury of the storm. It was almost as if the river was holding its breath, waiting for something. "Something feels off," John muttered as he stared into the dark water. "You're just getting old," Sarah, the youngest of the group, teased, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. She too felt it, a slight creeping unease threading through her nerves, but she tried to push it away. They'd faced worse storms, rougher waters. This would pass. "It's not the storm," John insisted, leaning in to speak more quietly, as if afraid the trees might overhear. "Something's wrong with the river. It's not right." The others laughed it off, their voices caught by the wind. But deep down, they all knew the river wasn't the same tonight. It was a whisper beneath the chaos, a warning they couldn't yet understand. As the night wore on, the storm raged, the fire flickered, and the group huddled together under the canvas of their tents, the howling wind pressing against the fabric like a living thing. The crackling of firewood was drowned out by the sounds of rain pounding the earth, but beneath it, another sound began to take root. A low, distant rumble, not quite thunder, but something far darker. By the time the storm reached its peak, none of them could sleep. They lay awake, listening to the strange noises around them, the snapping of branches in the trees, the eerie, echoing groan of the river, as if it were mourning. There was something in the air, something oppressive and ancient, that none of them could shake. And as the hours ticked on, a vague feeling gnawed at the edges of their minds, like a half-remembered dream slipping through their fingers. But eventually, the storm began to subside. The wind died down, and the rain slowed to a trickle. And with the silence came the strange sense of peace, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to come again. The silence that followed David's disappearance was suffocating, as if the very world held its breath. They paddled desperately toward the bank, hands shaking, hearts racing with every stroke. The air felt colder, denser. The whispers still clung to the space around them, like fingers brushing the backs of their necks. Their kayaks scraped against the rocky shore, the sound of the water meeting the land echoing ominously in the stillness. Sarah was the first to reach the bank, her feet unsteady as she stepped out of her kayak and onto the slippery rocks. She reached back toward her companions, helping Marcus and John ashore, their eyes wide with terror. But none of them spoke. None of them knew what to say. David's voice had been swallowed by the river. The last words they heard had echoed from every direction. There was no way to tell where he had been, or where he was now. Marcus crouched beside his overturned kayak, his face pale and hollow, his mind clearly struggling to grasp what had just occurred. What the hell happened? His voice cracked, almost a whisper, the fear thick in it. David, John began, his voice ragged. He looked into the water, as if expecting David to rise from the depths any moment, but there was only the still, dark surface. The whispering had quieted, but something about the air felt even more oppressive, as if the world itself was waiting for them to make a mistake, to break the silence. He was there, and then he was gone. His words hung heavily in the air. He was pulled under, Sarah whispered, her gaze fixed on the river. I saw it. I saw something, but it wasn't. Right. Her hand trembled as she wiped the cold sweat from her brow. It was like something grabbed him. What grabbed him? Marcus asked, his voice incredulous, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes now. The rational part of his mind wanted to reject it, to say it was all just an accident, but he couldn't ignore the strange sensation creeping up his spine. I don't know, Sarah muttered, her voice hollow. I couldn't see it. But the water, it wasn't just water. It felt alive. John stood still, his gaze never leaving the dark river. His mind raced with thoughts he couldn't quite piece together. Something deep within the river had taken David, something older, more ancient than any of them could comprehend. The eerie quiet that followed had only confirmed his suspicion. This wasn't a natural event. The river was alive in some way, and it wasn't done with them yet. We need to get back, Marcus said, his voice rising in panic. We need to go back to the camp, and then we get out of here, all of us. This place is wrong, but none of them moved. No one was ready to leave yet. I can't, Sarah said, shaking her head. Her eyes darted nervously over the water as if she could see David or something worse lurking just below the surface. Something's wrong. This isn't just about David. The quiet stillness of the river seemed to echo her words. There was no sound, except for the occasional drop of water falling from the trees, the rustle of leaves in the wind. But there was a presence in the air, something intangible but undeniable, something that didn't belong. What do you mean? John asked softly, his voice low and cautious. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the sense of dread was heavy on her chest, an unbearable weight. She could still hear the whispers, faint, like a murmured voice in the back of her mind. When I looked into the water, when I saw my reflection, she swallowed hard, her throat dry. It smiled at me. It wasn't me, John. I know it wasn't. Her words settled over the group, hanging like a thick fog. John frowned, his brow furrowing. He had known Sarah long enough to recognize the terror in her voice. She wasn't the type to exaggerate or panic. If she said something was wrong, it was. I didn't see it, John said, rubbing the back of his neck. But I felt something. The way the water shifted, the way it called out to us, it's not right. His voice trailed off as if the words were too heavy to finish. Something about the way Sarah described her reflections struck him deeply. It wasn't just the strange disappearance of David. There was something much older at play, The wind picked up again, a distant howl pushing through the canyon. The trees swayed, groaning in protest, and the sky darkened once more. The air grew colder, thicker, until it felt like the very breath of the earth was pressing down on them. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. It was David's voice, sharp, frantic, distorted, calling to them, "Help! Please, help me!" The voice echoed, but not from the direction they'd last seen him disappear. It was from the opposite bank, and the tone was wrong, twisted, elongated, as if it came from deep beneath the earth itself. It didn't sound like David, not anymore. The voice was strange, layered like 1,000 voices calling at once. And yet, it was so clear. Too clear. "David?" Sarah shouted, her voice trembling. She pushed herself forward, her body moving before her mind could catch up. "David, where are you? We're here. We're coming." But there was no reply. Instead, the whispers swirled around them again, rising like an unseen tide. The sound of water rushing beneath their kayaks grew louder, more insistent. The river was calling to them, beckoning them back to the water, to the place where David had vanished. John grabbed Sarah's arm, his grip tight and firm, but his own fear was now unmistakable. "We're not going back in that water. Do you hear me? We're not going back." But it was too late. The sound of the river, the voice of the river, it wasn't just calling to David anymore. It was calling to all of them. Marcus looked up at the sky, the clouds swirling ominously, twisting like smoke in the wind. "I don't know what's happening here," he said, his voice shaking, "but we're not safe, not here." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. Her gaze shifted to the water, and for a moment she thought she saw a shape moving beneath the surface, a figure, faint but unmistakable. It was David, or at least it looked like him. His face was pale, twisted with an expression of pure terror, his mouth open as if trying to scream, but there was no sound. The figure was submerged again before she could blink. "I saw him," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's still down there. He's trying to tell us something. Something's under the river, something that..." But before she could finish, a sudden splash interrupted her. Her heart skipped a beat. The water at the edge of the bank had surged violently, and a dark shape, too fast, too monstrous to be human, lunged from the depths, its form almost indistinct, a mass of shadows and rippling water. It was gone before anyone could react, but the feeling of something terrible, something ancient, hovered just beneath the surface. "Did you see that?" Marcus gasped. "What the hell was that?" John didn't answer. He only took a step back, his eyes locked on the water, his face pale. He had seen it too. He had seen what was lurking beneath the calm, waiting for them. The whispers rose again, louder this time, more urgent. And as they filled the air, one thing became clear to all of them. The river knew their names. And now it was coming for them. The stillness of the river had returned. The strange, creeping unease that had settled over the group grew heavier with every passing moment. The forest, though alive with the distant sounds of birds and the rustle of trees, felt almost oppressive. Now, as if the shadows themselves were moving in anticipation. The river, once wild and untamed, now lay flat and cold, a lifeless expanse of dark water stretching endlessly before them. Despite their best efforts, none of them could shake the sensation of being watched. It was as though the very river had its eyes trained on them, its dark depths crawling with something unseen, something that had been waiting for them long before their kayaks had touched the water. Sarah's hands trembled as she tightened her grip on the paddle. Her mind raced, thoughts colliding, struggling to find something, anything rational to explain the horrors they had witnessed. David's voice, distorted and frantic, had echoed through the canyon, but the river had claimed him. The whispering, water had tried to pull them in, had called their names as though it knew them intimately, as though it were part of them. And the river itself, it felt wrong, as if it was a living, breathing entity that had been asleep for centuries, only to wake with a hunger for more. She couldn't stop thinking about the reflection she'd seen in the water. It had been so clear, so sharp. Her face staring back at her, grinning in a way she knew she hadn't. The smile had stretched unnaturally wide, too wide for her face, pulling her features into something grotesque, something alien. The way her eyes, her own eyes, had glittered in that reflection, wide and unblinking, filled with a twisted kind of glee that she couldn't comprehend. It wasn't just a smile. It was a mockery. She had pulled away from the edge of the kayak, nearly toppling into the water, her heart hammering in her chest. It had felt like an omen, like the river had somehow known her, had recognized her, and in that recognition, had twisted her into something she didn't understand. Sarah? Marcus's voice broke through her thoughts. She blinked, focusing on him. His expression was tight, his brow furrowed with concern, but there was something deeper there now, something more than just fear. There was uncertainty in his eyes, a recognition that mirrored the doubt gnawing at her own stomach. "Are you okay?" he asked again, his voice softer now, more cautious. Sarah nodded, though the words felt foreign on her tongue. Okay. How could she be okay after what she'd seen? After what they had all just witnessed? She forced herself to speak, her voice shaking. "I don't know, Marcus. I don't know if I'm okay. There's something in the water. Something. It's watching. Us, it's waiting." John, who had been silent up until now, stepped closer to them. His face, usually so composed, now wore an expression that was hard to read, deep lines of worry, a furrowed brow that betrayed his growing unease. He had known the river for years, had trusted its currents, its flows, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that something had awakened. "Sarah's right," John said quietly. "We need to keep moving. We can't stay here." But it wasn't the safety of the shore that troubled them now. It was the river, the whispers, the reflection, the way it had known them. As they gathered their kayaks, moving toward the water's edge with trembling hands, Sarah's thoughts continued to race. She felt the pull of the river, stronger now, more insistent. As they prepared to push off into the water again, she found herself glancing once more at the smooth surface, the mirror-like expanse stretching before them. It was then that she saw it again. A ripple, not in the water but in her mind. The reflection in the water, her own face had shifted again. She was sure of it. For a moment, she could have sworn the smiling figure had moved, its eyes locking with hers. A cold shiver ran down her spine, her breath caught in her throat. She leaned over the edge of her kayak again, compelled by something she couldn't explain, something that called to her from the depths. The water was unnaturally still, too still. No current, no movement. But her reflection remained, more real than anything she had ever seen before. And yet, the face looking back at her was wrong. It was smiling, that same twisted grin, wider than it should have been, the edges of the mouth pulling back impossibly far. The eyes weren't her own. They were darker, almost hollow, glowing faintly beneath the surface. Her heartbeat quickened, her breath shallow. It was her, but it wasn't. She tore her eyes away from the water, too horrified to look any longer. A thick knot twisted in her stomach, a sense of dread gnawing at her insides. She didn't need to look again to know what was happening. The river, the water itself, was pulling at her. It had marked her, chosen her. And now it was whispering her name, its call growing louder with every passing second. "Sarah?" Marcus's voice again, sharp, filled with panic. "Sarah, what's happening?" Before she could respond, before she could even find the words, the whispering grew louder. It wasn't coming from just the water anymore. It was everywhere. The trees, the wind, The very ground beneath them, all of it was alive with the sound of their names, calling to them, urging them toward the river. And then, through the rising tide of voices, a new sound broke through. A voice, different from the others. It was distorted, almost guttural, but unmistakable. It was David's voice, twisted and stretched, calling for them. Help, help me, please, help me. The voice echoed around them, coming from every direction at once, 1,000 whispers converging into one distorted, painful cry. The air felt electric, charged with something dark and ancient. The wind picked up again, howling through the canyon, a mournful sound that seemed to carry the voices of the lost. John grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her away from the water's edge. "We're getting out of here now," he said, his voice hard with authority. But beneath it was a tremor of fear. But Sarah couldn't move. Her feet felt glued to the earth, her body frozen. The voice, it was so real, so close. David was out there somewhere, lost in the river's depths. But was it truly him? Or was it something else? Something using his voice to draw them in, to consume them one by one. "I can't leave him," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You have to," John insisted, his grip tightening as he dragged her away from the shore. "We're not going after him. Not in that water." But Sarah's eyes were still fixed on the river. She could feel it pulling at her, calling her back. And then, through the mist that had begun to settle around them like a blanket, she saw someone emerge from the water, David, or at least it looked like him. The figure was pale, drenched in water, but it wasn't moving right. His body was contorted at odd angles, as if the water had twisted him into something inhuman. His eyes were wide and unblinking, but there was no recognition in them, only an empty, hollow gaze that seemed to pierce through Sarah, through all of them. "David," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached out instinctively, but as she did, the figure jerked violently and disappeared beneath the surface with a single, horrifying gasp. "No." Sarah's breath hitched, her voice catching in her throat. "No, no, no." The whispers rose again, louder than ever, overwhelming, suffocating. The water churned as though it were alive, the surface rippling and boiling with unseen forces beneath. "Move, now!" John's command cut through the chaos, but it was too late. The river wasn't done with them, it was only just beginning. The moment the figure of David disappeared beneath the surface, the world around them seemed to crack open. The stillness of the river shattered like fragile glass, and a pulse of cold, suffocating dread radiated out from the water. The air thickened, almost choking them, as if the very atmosphere was pregnant with something unseen, something ancient. The whispers, the voices that had been creeping at the edge of their awareness, became deafening now, like 1,000 murmurs filling the space between their ears, each voice distinct and agonizingly familiar. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. The sight of David, or what she thought had been David, had been enough to break something inside her. She felt as though her very soul had been touched by something vile, something that didn't belong in the world. The way his body had jerked, lifeless and twisted, only to vanish into the depths, left her breathless. Was that really him? She couldn't bring herself to look at the water again. The swirling surface seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a mocking echo of David's disappearance, a reminder that the river was not just a body of water, it was something far darker. "Get back!" John's voice cut through the rising. Panic, rough with authority and fear. He was still gripping her arm, his knuckles white against her skin as he pulled her away from the bank. But Sarah was frozen, her mind reeling from what she'd just seen, from what the river had taken from them. The others were in a similar state of shock. Marcus's eyes were wide with terror, darting frantically between the river and his friends, his hands trembling uncontrollably on the paddle. "What the hell was that?" His voice broke through the fog of dread, sharp and desperate. "I don't know," John rasped, glancing toward the water again, his face pale and drawn. "But we need to get out of here. Now!" He shoved Sarah forward, his voice uncharacteristically frantic, as if he were afraid that if they didn't leave soon, they too would be swallowed by the river, consumed by whatever dark force lurked beneath its surface. But before they could even begin to move, the whispers grew louder, thickening the air around them. The sound was everywhere, like an invisible tide rising to drown them. Their names, distorted and agonized, sliced through the wind. Sarah, John, Marcus. It was impossible to tell where the voices came from. One moment it felt as if they were coming from the trees. The next, they echoed from the ground beneath their feet. It was as though the very earth itself was speaking, calling to them, pulling them deeper into its twisted embrace. Sarah shook her head, clenching her hands into fists. "No, this isn't happening, this isn't real." But it was real. The chill in the air, the suffocating weight of the voices, they were as real as the river that had claimed David. The world had bent, twisted, and now they were trapped in something that defied all reason. "We need to go!" Marcus shouted, his voice breaking. "We need to get back to camp. We need to leave." But they were not alone anymore. A strange movement in the water caught Sarah's eye. She turned, and her stomach twisted as she saw the water ripple violently, as though something huge was stirring beneath the surface. The movement was unmistakable. It wasn't just a shift in the current. Something massive was shifting below, rising up from the depths. The water churned, foamed, and then a hand emerged. It was pale and slick with water, fingers long and twisted, nails sharp like broken glass. It reached toward them with a slow, deliberate motion, as if it were testing the air, feeling its way through the fog of terror that surrounded them. The hand was followed by another, and then another, each emerging with the same slow, deliberate precision. It was alive. Before anyone could react, a figure broke the surface. At first it looked like David, pale and drenched, his hair matted. To his skull, his eyes wide and unseeing. But there was something wrong. So horribly wrong. His limbs hung loosely, as if they were not his own, contorted at unnatural angles, his face slack and featureless, save for the gaping hole in his mouth where his scream should have been. His skin was stretched thin, translucent in places, revealing the dark, pulsating mass of veins beneath. It wasn't just David. It was something else, something worse, a mockery of the person they had known. The figure staggered forward, its movements jerky, erratic, like a marionette being pulled on invisible strings. As it moved, the river surged in response, the water undulating as though it were alive, feeding off the thing that had risen from it. "David," Sarah whispered, her voice raw. Her body refused to move, as if the figure before her had a gravitational pull that kept her frozen, rooted to the spot. The thing that had once been David stopped just a few feet from her, its head tilting unnaturally to the side, its mouth opening wide as if to speak. But no sound came. Instead, it raised its hand, still dripping with water, and reached toward her, her stomach twisted, nausea rising in her throat. The figure's face was too far gone, the features blurred, distorted, its eyes pools of darkness that seemed to swallow the world around her. It wasn't just David anymore, it was the river itself, a force, a presence, a twisted, relentless hunger that could devour anything and everything in its path. "Get back!" John shouted again, this time shoving Sarah away from the thing, but it wasn't enough. In that moment, time seemed to stretch and bend. Sarah felt herself falling backward, her hands scraping against the wet, slick rocks, her heart racing as the water churned violently beneath her. The figure lunged, its arm reaching out for her, fingers twisting and curling as if to drag her into the depths. With a cry, Sarah jerked back, managing to scramble to her feet. The others were backing away now, but it was too late. The whispers had become a cacophony, a maddening sound that threatened to drown them all. "Run!" John's voice cut through the chaos, and for the first time, his authority was overwhelmed by fear. They all turned and bolted, scrambling up the muddy bank, slipping on the slick stones, their eyes wide with terror. The figure that had once been David was still there, still watching them from the edge of the water, its limbs jerking unnaturally, its hollow eyes fixed on Sarah. But as they ran, Sarah's heart lurched as something even worse happened. The river didn't just rise, it followed them. The water surged, moving like an enormous living thing, crawling up the riverbank, following their every step. It was like the earth itself had been ripped open, a vast and terrible mouth stretching across, the land intent on consuming them. Sarah's lungs burned with the effort to run, to escape, but the river was faster. The ground beneath her feet began to buckle, and the mist around them thickened into a near impenetrable wall. Every step she took felt heavier, as if something was pulling her back, urging her to turn and face the horrors she had just witnessed. But she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. And then, just as her legs gave out beneath her, a terrible noise split the air. The sound of water, thick and roiling, crashing against the land. It was the river, and it was coming for them. The world had shrunk to a terrifying blur as Sarah and the others scrambled to the safety of the trees. The sound of the river, alive, surging and splashing behind them, seemed to echo from every direction, following them as if it had claimed their very souls. The very air felt alive with malevolent energy. Each breath was a struggle against the oppressive weight of dread that pressed against their chests. Sarah's heart was a drum in her ears as her legs burned with the effort of running. She wasn't sure how long they had been running or how far they had gone, only that the water's pursuit was relentless, a flood that seemed to roll beneath her feet, pulling at her, dragging her toward the river's beckoning mouth. Every time she dared to glance behind her, the water rose higher, creeping over rocks, spilling onto the shore as though the land itself were being devoured by an unseen force. The trees around them, once sturdy and solid, now felt like ghosts. Distant, insubstantial. The wind howled through their branches, making the shadows dance in unnatural ways. It was as if the very forest were alive with whispers, each leaf, each rustling twig echoing with the same unnerving murmur that had filled their ears by the riverbank. But they couldn't stop. Not yet. "Over here," John's voice sliced through, the chaos, sharp and panicked. He had found something, a small clearing near the edge of the forest. They all gathered there, breathing heavily, sweat running down their faces. But it wasn't enough. The river was still there, at the back of their minds, an omnipresent force, and it wouldn't let them rest. "Where's Marcus?" Sarah gasped, scanning the frantic group. John was there, his chest heaving as he knelt on the forest floor, trying to catch his breath. But Marcus wasn't with them. Her stomach dropped like a stone as the realization hit her. They had lost him. They had been running in blind panic, but they hadn't noticed that Marcus wasn't there. "Marcus!" Sarah screamed, her voice hoarse, breaking on the air. She turned, eyes wild, scanning the dark woods around them. There was no sign of him. "Shit!" John cursed under his breath, standing up quickly. Where the hell did he go? Did he fall behind? Sarah's voice trembled, but a deep, gnawing dread told her it wasn't just that. It wasn't just losing him in the chaos. It was something more, something worse. "We've got to go back," Sarah said, her voice desperate. She knew what it meant to return, to go back toward the river. Every part of her screamed not to. But Marcus was out there, alone. She couldn't leave him behind. John shook his head, his brow furrowing. "Sarah, we can't. You saw what happened. The river, it's not just the river. It's something else. It's... His voice faltered, unable to finish. There were no words for what they had witnessed. Not really. No explanation for the twisted, unnatural things they had seen in the water. But Sarah wouldn't listen. Her mind was made up. We have to go back. We can't leave him. Before anyone could stop her, Sarah turned and dashed back toward the trees. She ran, her legs feeling like lead, the air around her thick with dread. She knew, on some primal level, that going back toward the river was insanity. But Marcus, her friend, her companion, her family, was out there, and she couldn't just leave him. Not like this. Behind her, she heard John shout her name, but she ignored it, pressing onward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could feel the pull, the magnetic tug of the river behind her. It called to her, in the same way it had called to her at the water's edge. She could almost hear it whispering again, her name soft, urgent. But she shoved it aside. Not now. Not now. The forest grew darker the farther she went, the canopy above thick and oppressive, blocking out the sky. The world around her began to distort, the trees bending unnaturally, the wind tugging at her hair in strange patterns. She kept running, her feet slipping on the wet ground. But the pull of the river, the terror that clung to the air, made her forget the cold, the wet, the fear. The whispers grew louder as she ventured deeper into the woods. At first she thought it was the wind again, but it wasn't. No. The whispers were too clear, too deliberate. Sarah. 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 Her name was repeated over and over, growing louder, stretching like a thread pulling her forward. It wasn't the wind. It was coming from everywhere, the trees, the ground, the water beneath the earth. The voices merged into one unholy chorus, and with each passing second, Sarah's feet grew heavier. Her skin prickled with the sensation of being watched. She could feel the darkness pressing in on her from all sides. Something was here. Something was moving through the shadows, stalking her. And then she heard something else, a faint rustling, a branch snapping somewhere ahead. She froze, her blood running cold. Marcus. She had to find him. She pushed forward, stepping cautiously, every nerve in her body on edge. The wind had died down, leaving the forest eerily still. Not a sound reached her ears except for the pounding of her own heart. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it, a flicker of movement in the trees. A figure. Its shape was distorted, unclear at first, but then Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized what it was. The same figure that had risen from the river. Its form was just as twisted, just as contorted. It was Marcus, or something that looked like Marcus. The figure lurched toward her, its limbs bending in unnatural angles. It didn't move like a human. It was too quick, too erratic. The face, oh, the face, was hollowed out, stretched unnaturally thin, as if the skin had been pulled tight over a skull. But the eyes were wide, gleaming in the dark, bloodshot and filled with something that wasn't quite fear. It wasn't just Marcus's face. It was something else, something worse. Marcus? Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of hope and terror. The figure did not respond. It moved faster now, a twitching, jerking motion that made her want to run. But her legs wouldn't obey. Her body was frozen, rooted to the ground, trapped in the same way she had been trapped before, caught in the pull of the water, in the gaze of the thing that had once been her friend. And then the whispers came again, louder than ever, all around her. Sarah. It was Marcus's voice, but not his voice. It was distorted, stretched, ragged, as if the river itself had taken his breath, had twisted his soul into something else entirely. Help me. The figure moved closer now, its mouth opening wide, But there was no scream, no cry for help, just silence, a silence that seemed to swallow everything. In that moment, Sarah understood. The river had claimed him. It had taken him and changed him, twisted him into something monstrous. The pull, the whispers, the things that had risen from the depths, they were not just after her, they were after all of them. And soon, they would come for her too. With a final desperate scream, Sarah broke free of her paralysis. She turned and ran back into the woods, her heart racing, but the figure, Marcus, was still there, following her, its limbs jerking with every step. The darkness in the forest seemed to close in tighter now, the whispers clawing at her mind. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't stop. The earth beneath Sarah's feet was slick with mud and the dampness of the forest. Every breath she drew felt like it might be her last, as the air grew heavier with the weight of an unseen presence. The trees, once familiar and comforting, now seemed to loom over her, their twisted branches curling like dark fingers reaching toward the sky. She could hear the faint rustling of leaves in the wind, but it wasn't the same as before. It was more deliberate, more calculated, like the trees were whispering to each other in a language she couldn't understand. Behind her, the figure, Marcus, or what had once been Marcus, staggered forward, moving too quickly, too unnaturally. She could hear its labored breathing, each jagged inhale and exhale a twisted mimicry of human life. It wasn't just the loss of Marcus anymore. It was the realization that whatever force had claimed him, whatever had changed him, wasn't done. It was hunting her now. Her legs burned with the effort to run, but no matter how fast she pushed forward, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. The thing that had once been her friend was gaining on her, and with it, the relentless whispers. They were no longer just in the wind or the trees. They were inside her head now, circling like vultures, feeding on her fear. Sarah, Thuff. Voice was so clear, so real, she almost stopped, almost turned around. It was Marcus's voice, but warped and stretched, as though something else had put words in his mouth. It was full of anguish, but there was no real emotion behind it. Only emptiness. Sarah, please, help me. No, no, no. The thought churned in her mind like acid. Don't listen to it. She had seen what happened when they listened to the river's call, when they let the voices twist them. But she could feel the weight of it, the call of the water, the draw of the thing that had once been Marcus, and she could feel it pulling at her, the cold fingers of the river's darkness sinking into her skin. Ahead, the trees thinned. She was nearing the edge of the forest, nearing the place where the river had once looked like a sanctuary, where the sound of the water was peaceful, where they had been so sure of their safety. The memory of it seemed so distant now. Now the river was not a place of peace, but a place of hunger, a place where the water didn't just flow, it devoured, it consumed. She burst into the clearing, her eyes wide, frantic. But the river was no longer where it had been. The entire landscape had changed. The riverbank had stretched outward, like the land itself had been pulled, reshaped. The water that had once seemed so calm now raged, its dark surface churning as though it were a living, breathing entity. The edges of the water rippled violently, as if unseen currents were pulling at the world itself. The mist hung thick in the air, swirling in unnatural patterns, blocking out the sun. The trees seemed to bow away from the water's edge, their branches curving as if recoiling from the river's reach. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized the truth. The river had moved. The forest had moved. This place, this nightmare, was no longer the world she knew. The river had altered it, changed it, turned it into a thing of its own dark design. There was no safety here, no escape. Sarah. The whisper of her name, Again, closer this time. Too close. The sound came from the river from beneath the churning surface. And then, rising up, her eyes widened in horror as a figure emerged from the depths. It was David. At least it looked like David. His form was soaked and bent, his limbs contorted, his face pale and twisted. His eyes were empty, hollowed out, nothing but dark sockets staring back at her. The skin on his face had pulled tight over his bones, giving him a skeletal appearance. But it was his mouth, his grin, that froze her in place. The grin stretched unnaturally wide, far beyond the confines of a normal human mouth. It was the same twisted smile she had seen in her reflection in the water. The thing that had once been David, if it ever had been, now seemed to mock her, to revel in her terror. Sarah. His voice was a rasp, unnatural and deep, as if it came from the very pit of the river itself. It was not the voice of her friend. It was the river's voice twisting through the remains of her memory. "Don't listen," she whispered to herself, but the words came out hollow. The weight of the river's pull was too much, its grip too tight. David's figure stretched, distorting in the water as if the river itself were trying to drag him back into its depths. But the river wasn't the only thing calling to her now. The voice came from all around her, from the water, from the trees, from the earth itself. "Sarah, come to us." Her breath caught. The whispers rose to a crescendo, pulling at her very soul. She could feel the river pulling at her, could feel it inside her, its hunger sinking into her skin, into her heart. She wanted to look away. She needed to look away. But something in the water, in David's face, held her like a trap. And then from the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A figure emerged from the trees. It was John. But as he stepped into the clearing, his face was blank, his eyes hollow, just like David's. His movements were stiff, jerky, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. "John?" Sarah's voice broke, trembled as she stepped toward him. She reached out, but as she did, her feet seemed to sink into the earth itself. The ground felt soft, malleable, like it was pulling her into the soil. John's lips moved, but the words didn't make sense. His voice was the river's now, stretched and hollowed. "It's too late, Sarah. We've all been chosen." "John." "No!" she screamed, but it was too late. His body lurched forward as if in response to some unseen force, and he collapsed at her feet. His hand shot out to grab her ankle, pulling her toward the water's edge. "We all belong to the river now," he whispered, his eyes still empty, his body stiff with the unnatural grace of something that was no longer fully human. Before she could react, the ground beneath her feet cracked, splitting open, and the river surged forward with a deafening roar, its waves rising as though it were a giant creature awakening from its slumber. The water swirled around her, pulling at her legs, at her very soul, and Sarah screamed. "Help!" she cried. But the word was swallowed by the waves, lost in the endless hunger of the water. As she felt herself being dragged toward the dark depths, she realized, too late, that the river knew her name. It had always known it, and now it was taking her, like it had taken David and Marcus, like it had taken them all. The water was not just a place. It was an ancient thing, a presence, a force that had always been waiting for the right moment to claim them. The water closed over her, and the world went dark. The world around Sarah was darkness, endless, suffocating, an abyss with no end. The pull of the river was overwhelming, its depths reaching out to swallow her whole. Her body felt weightless, as if the water itself had become her entire existence, her limbs floating in a void where time and space didn't matter anymore. The crushing pressure of the water around her was like a force trying to push the very breath from her lungs, but there was no escape. No air, no light. just the relentless tug of the river dragging her deeper, farther into its grasp. But then, something changed. A flicker of light pierced the darkness, faint but undeniable. It shimmered like a distant star, far away, but it called to her. It wasn't warmth, no. It was something colder, more alien. It was a memory. Her body fought against the current, against the pull of the water, trying to follow that distant light. She couldn't stop herself. She had to know what it was. She broke through the surface. The night air rushed in, freezing against her skin, her lungs gasping for a breath she hadn't realized she needed. She clawed her way to the shore, the rocky riverbank beneath her fingers, and pulled herself up, shuddering with the force of her body demanding to be free of the water that had claimed it. The river was still there, calm once again, its surface like glass. But it wasn't the same. It was different now, darker, almost as if it had been stained by the horrors it had consumed. The mist from the water hung in the air, thick and suffocating, swirling in patterns that seemed to form faces she didn't recognize but somehow knew. Sarah's chest heaved as she collapsed onto the wet ground, gasping for air, her body trembling uncontrollably. She had escaped. But what had she escaped into? The silence was unbearable. There was no sound but the thudding of her heart and the distant rustle of the trees. The whispers had stopped, the voices of the river, the pull of the water. They were gone, or at least muted. But the stillness was worse than the cacophony of voices. It was a silence that threatened to swallow her whole, a silence that felt wrong in a way she couldn't describe. She wasn't alone. She knew that much. Something watched her from the edges of the forest, from the depths of the river. It was then that she saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was John, but it wasn't John. His face was pale, too pale, his skin stretched tight across his bones, his eyes hollow and empty. His hair hung limp and wet, matted against his forehead, and his mouth was twisted into that same grotesque, inhuman smile she had seen in the water. His body was rigid, unnatural, jerking with every movement, as if every muscle were being pulled by invisible strings. "John?" Her voice cracked, barely a whisper, but there was no recognition in his eyes, no humanity. He didn't speak. Instead, he moved toward her slowly, as though the earth itself was trying to pull him into the ground. His steps were unnatural, uneven, but he was coming closer, his body jerking with every stride, but his eyes fixed on her as though he were tracking her every move. "John, please," Sarah begged, her voice trembling, but her body stayed rooted to the spot. She couldn't move, couldn't pull herself away from the terrible gaze of his hollow eyes. "Please, it's me, it's Sarah." But there was no response. John didn't hear her, or perhaps he couldn't hear her. He just kept coming, his hands stretched toward her with that same cold, unfeeling smile, his body moving like a puppet caught in the grip of the river's ancient force. Then, from behind him, another figure emerged from the mist, David, the same figure she had seen in the water. His eyes were the same, hollow, empty. But this time, there was something more. His skin was translucent, and his form seemed to shimmer in the dim light, as though he were not fully there. He was floating just above the ground, his feet barely touching the earth as he moved, his body swaying with the current of an unseen tide. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "No. No, this isn't real." David's mouth opened wide, but the words that came out were not his. They were the river's voice, cold and ancient, rasping from the depths of the earth itself. "You are part of us now." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a statement. It was a command, a declaration. And somehow, in the pit of her stomach, Sarah knew it was true. She was no longer herself. She had been claimed, just like them. The river had taken her, just as it had taken the others. The pull was inevitable. "No!" she screamed, fighting with everything she had. I'm not part of you!" But the words meant nothing. The river's will was stronger than her defiance. She could feel it, wrapping around her like tendrils, pulling at her thoughts, at her very essence. Her body felt weak, like the very life force was being drained from her, and she staggered back, her legs buckling beneath her. The ground began to tremble. John and David, or whatever had been them, moved closer, their forms blurring in the mist. The forest seemed to bend and warp with them, the trees twisting in ways they shouldn't. The clearing around her felt like it was becoming smaller, more suffocating, as if the very earth was folding in on itself. "Sarah," the voice whispered, but it wasn't just the river's voice anymore. It was all of them, the ones who had been taken, the ones who had been consumed. "Join us." Sarah's legs gave out, her back hitting the ground with a sickening thud. Her hands reached out, pressing against the dirt as she tried to crawl away. But the earth beneath her palms was soft, wet, like the ground itself was alive. The water surged around her again, creeping from the river, pulling toward her as though the earth itself were being drawn back into the river's maw. The faces in the mist stared at her, twisted, distorted, some unrecognizable, others too familiar. They were the ones who had vanished, the ones who had been claimed. The river had taken them, had turned them into something else, something that was neither alive nor dead. The whispers intensified, louder now, deafening. "Join us. Join us. Join us." The river reached for her again, and this time she couldn't fight it. The pull was too strong, too unrelenting. She felt herself being lifted, the ground giving way beneath her, her hands slipping through the wet earth. Unable to hold on, with one final scream, Sarah's body was consumed by the river. The voices reached their peak, a terrible chorus of laughter and screams that merged into one. And then, the river was still. The forest, the clearing, the land, they were all quiet once again, as if nothing had ever happened. The mist hung heavy, in the air, and the river flowed, calm once more. But somewhere deep beneath the surface, the river knew her name, and it was waiting for the next, the end, or perhaps just the beginning. The morning after Sarah's disappearance came with an eerie stillness. The sun rose weakly through the thick veil of mist that clung to the river, casting long, spectral shadows across the riverbank. The forest, once full of life, seemed drained of its vibrancy, as if the earth itself had been scarred by something unspeakable. Birds, usually loud and brazen, were conspicuously silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The kayaks were abandoned on the shore, just as they had been. The night before, their hulls cracked and waterlogged, floating lazily in the mist-covered water. No one had touched them, no one had returned to claim them. There was no sign of the group, no trace of Sarah, no trace of Marcus, no trace of the others who had vanished into the depths of the river. Only the faintest traces of footprints in the mud, leading nowhere. The park rangers arrived in the early hours, following the path along the river's edge with practiced steps, their boots sinking slightly into the wet earth. They were a pair, Ranger Allen and Ranger Sutherland. Both had worked in these woods for years, knew the river's unpredictable currents, and had seen their fair share of accidents. But this felt different. The air was heavy, and the silence oppressive. Ranger Allen squinted against the damp morning light, his gaze scanning the bank, the overgrown paths, the thick forest beyond. "I don't like this, Sutherland. Something about it doesn't sit right." Sutherland nodded grimly, adjusting the strap of his pack. You mean other than the fact that we're looking for 5 people who are nowhere to be found, and the only thing we have to go on is a couple of abandoned kayaks? His voice was edged with sarcasm, but it was clear he shared Alan's unease. The storm last night was rough, but this is different. The 2 rangers walked cautiously toward the river, the heavy mist swirling around their legs. The river's surface had returned to its unnerving calm, so still that it seemed unreal. In the heavy silence, every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves seemed magnified, making their skin prickle. Ranger Alan knelt beside one of the kayaks, his fingers tracing the waterlogged hull, his brow furrowed. No signs of a struggle.
Here, they weren't thrown into the water. They just vanished. Sutherland crouched down beside him, examining the area. There's no sign of a fight, no blood, no overturned gear. Hell, it looks like they just walked off and left the kayaks
behind. Who does that, Alan? The 2 rangers exchanged uneasy glances. The situation was beginning to feel surreal, like something out of a nightmare. The forest was too quiet, the river too calm. It was as though nature itself had turned against them, folding in on itself, becoming something that was no longer the place they thought they knew. Sutherland stood, casting a glance around the area. Maybe they left in a panic, headed inland, tried to make it to the trailhead. It's only a few miles from here. That would explain the footprints. He pointed to the faint outline of wet footprints, leading from the shore and disappearing into the woods. Alan didn't answer right away. His eyes were still trained on the water. The same feeling that had gnawed at him since they arrived continued to tighten in his chest. Something was wrong. Something more than a missing group of kayakers. Something deeper. I don't know, Sutherland. It doesn't feel like they left in a hurry. These footprints, they're too even, too deliberate. Deliberate? Sutherland raised an eyebrow, skepticism in his voice. Come on, Alan, let's get a grip. There's nothing deliberate about this. We have no idea what happened here. Maybe they got disoriented in the storm, wandered off, or worse, got swept up by the current. But Alan wasn't listening. His gaze remained locked on the river, his eyes narrowing. It's not the storm I'm worried about. It's something else. A strange rustle in the trees interrupted their conversation. It wasn't the wind. It was movement. They both spun around instinctively, but the forest beyond them was still, unmoving, silent. Sutherland shook his head, muttering to himself, "We need to stop listening to this damn place." But Alan wasn't convinced. He stood slowly, his hand brushing his holster absent-mindedly, a strange tension radiating from him. "We're not alone out here," he muttered under his breath. Sutherland looked at his partner, confusion and concern flickering in his eyes. "What do you mean?" Alan didn't respond. He only turned slowly and began walking toward the woods. The footprints, half faded but still distinguishable, called to him. Every step felt like an omen, every inch of ground that passed beneath his feet, dragging him further into something he couldn't explain, something he didn't want to acknowledge. Sutherland followed reluctantly, his hand reaching for the walkie-talkie on his belt. He tried to break the silence. "Ranger Jackson, this is Sutherland. We're going to need backup down here. Over." The static crackled, and then a voice came, through, distorted. "Roger that, Sutherland. Backup en route. Any updates on the missing kayakers?" Sutherland hesitated, glancing at Alan, who had already reached the edge of the tree line. He didn't know how to explain it. How could he? But there was something in the air, something thick and suffocating that made his skin crawl. Something about this felt wrong. Nothing yet. Just keep coming. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before the voice crackled again. "Understood. Stay safe out there."
Sutherland put the radio back in its holder and walked toward Alan. who was now crouched by a small cluster of trees at the edge of the woods. He was staring at something that had caught his eye. "Alan, what is it?" Sutherland asked.
His voice low, cautious. Alan's voice was almost a whisper when he spoke, his breath coming out in a strained exhale. "Footprints, but these aren't right. They don't lead anywhere. Just stop." Sutherland squatted down beside him, looking at the ground. The footprints were there, clear enough, but they didn't make sense. There were no signs of someone walking deeper into the forest. No impression of weight on the earth, just the faintest traces as if the feet had barely touched the ground at all. Sutherland's heart began to race. "These aren't human tracks," Alan nodded grimly. "They're too deliberate." The hairs on the back of Sutherland's neck stood on end as a cold breeze rushed past him, stirring the leaves. He glanced around, suddenly feeling the weight of something unseen pressing down on them. "I think we need to get back to the boats," he said, standing quickly. "Something's not right here." But Alan didn't move. His gaze was fixed on the ground, and his hand was shaking as he pointed to something just ahead. Sutherland followed the line of his finger, and his heart skipped a beat. There, just beyond the trees, was a faint shimmering reflection in the water. It wasn't the surface of the river. It was something else. Someone else. A pale, twisted figure floating just beneath the water's surface, watching them with eyes that glimmered faintly in the dim light. Alan stood slowly, his face ashen, his voice barely a whisper. "That's them." The figure shifted. It rose from the water, its form bloated, distorted, as it jerked toward them. Sutherland's heart stopped. The whispers returned, soft at first, then growing louder, echoing from the water, from the trees, from the very air around them. "Join us." The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble as if the earth itself was shifting. Sutherland grabbed Alan's arm, yanking him away from the water. "Let's go. Now." But it was too late. The river wasn't just water, it was a living thing, and it was hungry. The air felt thicker now, heavier with a sense of impending doom that seemed to cling to everything. The trees, the ground, the very mist that hung like a shroud over the river. The reflection in the water shifted again, twisting in grotesque motion, as though something was pushing up from beneath the surface, struggling to break free. The whispers swirled around them, not just from the river anymore, but from the trees, the very earth beneath their boots, as if the land itself was speaking. "Join us." The voices were low, layered, overlapping like the murmurs of 1,000 lost souls. It was a chorus of voices, too many to count, each one familiar, each one distinct, and yet all of them bound together by a darkness that stretched through time itself. Sutherland's stomach twisted in dread. He could feel it then, the pull, a force far greater than he had imagined. He turned to Alan, his voice ragged, as if it was being squeezed out of him against his will. "We need to leave. Now." He could barely get the words out. The sight before them was too much to comprehend, too impossible to understand, and yet he felt it in the pit of his stomach. The river wasn't just a body of water. It was a living thing, a force, something ancient and hungry. Alan didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the dark, shimmering figure in the water, its distorted form rising slowly from the depths, like a dream that was too real to be imagined. His face had gone ashen, his jaw set, his expression a strange mix of terror and disbelief. It was clear he didn't know whether to run or to stay, whether to fight or to succumb. "Is that—" Sutherland's voice faltered. He had never been one for legends, for ghost stories, but in that moment, something deep inside him stirred, an old, gnawing sense of recognition. The stories he had heard growing up in these mountains,
Stories that had always seemed too fantastical, too insane to be true, flooded back into his mind one by one. The river spirit, the one that claimed those who dared trespass too deeply into its waters, pulling them into its depths. It had been a tale passed down for generations, but no one ever really believed it. At least not until now. The stories had always been vague, clouded with superstition and fear. But the one thing they all had in common was this: the river did not take its victims by accident. It knew their names, and it claimed them when the time was right. Alan's voice broke the silence, hoarse and barely audible, as if speaking the words made them real. The tidewater, that's what they used to call it. The river spirit, the one who takes you, if you're unlucky enough to hear its voice. His words were quiet, like a man recounting an old nightmare, and yet there was something final in them. Sutherland's mind raced. The river spirit, the tidewater, was an old local legend. It was said to be an ancient entity, older than the river itself, feeding on the souls of the lost, the ones who wandered too far, too deep into its domain. It was a spirit of the water, the forest, the land, a creature that thrived on fear and sorrow. The legend spoke of its hunger, its twisted need to claim those who dared to disturb its peace. It wasn't a mere story, it was a curse, an endless cycle of victims caught in its eternal embrace. Sutherland had thought it was just a myth, a fairy tale. But looking at the figures now rising from the river, their faces distorted with a horrible grin, their eyes hollow and empty, he understood. The stories weren't just stories. The tidewater was real. The ground beneath their feet trembled, sending a shiver through Sutherland's spine. It was as if the earth itself was alive, shifting with the weight of something ancient and terrible. The water surged forward, the mist swirling around them like a living thing, clawing at their legs, trying to pull them in. "Alan, we need to get out of here," Sutherland said again, but there was no response. His partner was frozen, staring at the figure in the water. His face was pale, his eyes wide, with a fear that went beyond reason. The figure in the water moved again, but this time it wasn't just a reflection. It was more solid now, more real. The water parted around it, revealing a face, a twisted, bloated face, pale, hollow-eyed, its mouth stretched wide in that grotesque, mocking grin. The figure rose slowly from the depths, its limbs jerking, unnatural, like it was being forced into motion by something far more powerful than the body itself. "Join us," it rasped, the voice cold and distant, but somehow familiar, as though it was coming from the depths of the earth itself. "Come back, we are waiting." Sutherland felt the bile rise in his throat. The voice, it was Sarah's, it was Marcus's too, and David's, the voices of the lost, all of them calling from the river, beckoning to him, pulling him closer, his breath caught in his throat. "It's not them," he whispered, his voice breaking. He turned to Alan, grabbing his arm. "Alan, we need to leave now." But Alan wasn't responding. His gaze was fixed on the figure in the water, his eyes wide with terror. "It's too late," he whispered, his voice distant. "It's already here." Sutherland yanked Alan's arm, shaking him. "Alan, snap out of it." The ranger's surroundings began to warp. The trees bent unnaturally toward the water, their branches like claws reaching for the sky. The mist thickened, coiling around them like a serpent, cutting off the path they had taken. The forest, the land, the river itself, all of it seemed to be closing in on them, swallowing them whole. Alan's voice was hollow, as though the words were dragged from the depths of him. "It's always been here. The river, it knows. It's never left. We've only been waiting for it to call." Sutherland's blood ran cold. He understood now. The river had always been here, always waiting, always calling, drawing people in one by one. It didn't need to find them. It only needed to wait. And once it had their name, once it had marked them, there was no escape. The trees behind them began to shake violently. The ground split open in jagged cracks as if the river's pulse had reached deeper into the earth. And then, from the darkened sky, a voice, no, 1,000 voices, rose in a terrible, bone-chilling chorus. "Join us!" Sutherland turned, his legs moving without thought. He had to get out, had to survive. But he knew, deep in his heart, that he was already too late. The river had already taken them. It would take him too. With one final, desperate scream, he bolted toward the woods, the whispers and voices chasing after him like a dark tide. But no matter how fast he ran, no matter how far he pushed himself, the forest seemed to close in. Tighter, the ground beneath him crumbling away. The river was never far behind, and it was calling his name. Sutherland's breath was ragged, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest as he pushed through the dense underbrush. Every step he took felt like it might be his last, each footfall sinking into the soft, damp earth as if the land itself was trying to hold him in place. The forest, once familiar, now seemed alien, distorted by the presence of the river, by the malevolent force that clung to every shadow, every twisted branch. He didn't dare look back. The whispers were louder now, a rising chorus of voices that wrapped around him, curling through the trees, slithering into his mind. Some of the voices were familiar, Sarah's, Marcus's, David's, but others were distorted, too far gone, echoing from the depths of the river, calling him toward the water. He could feel the pull, a tangible weight pressing against his chest, as if the very earth were trying to drag him back into the river's depths. "Join us!" The voice came again, soft at first, then louder, sharper, more insistent. The pull of it was undeniable, like a cold, invisible hand wrapping around his heart, squeezing. He stumbled, his legs giving out beneath him, but he caught himself on a nearby tree, gasping for air. The air around him was thick with moisture, the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves, but there was something more, a faint metallic tang in the air, like the river had left its mark on the land itself. He couldn't stop, he couldn't look back, but no matter how hard he tried, the ground seemed to shift beneath him. The path he had taken, the one he had so desperately tried to follow, was no longer there. The forest was closing in on him, the trees leaning toward him as if they had become part of the river's will, part of its dark pull. Sutherland's feet slipped on the wet ground as he scrambled to regain his balance, his mind racing. He had to find them. He had to get to the others. The voices, they were calling to him, but they were not his friends anymore. They were the river's voices. The tidewater had claimed them all, twisted them into something unrecognizable, and now it wanted him too. A sudden sharp crack of a branch broke his frantic thoughts, and he froze. His eyes darted around the darkening woods. The mist seemed to be thickening, swirling around him, filling the air with a soft, ghostly whisper. He strained his ears. There was something moving, something not right. The woods were too silent, too still. He could feel it. Something was wrong. He wasn't alone. The ground beneath him shifted again, but this time, it wasn't just the earth. It was the river. The water, though distant, was creeping closer, its presence unmistakable. The river wasn't just confined to its banks. It was spreading, reaching out, following him like an ancient predator stalking its prey. He turned, and there, just ahead, in the growing shadows, he saw a figure, tall, drenched, its clothes clinging to its body like a second skin. The figure was staring at him, unmoving, but Sutherland's blood ran cold when he recognized it. It was Alan. His partner's face was pale and contorted, his eyes wide with a kind of unblinking horror. His skin was too white, stretched thin, over his bones, and his mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, just like the others, just like the ones who had been taken. And behind him, beyond the trees, Sutherland could hear the unmistakable sound of the river rising, the water surging closer. "Alan!" Sutherland shouted, his voice desperate. He tried to take a step forward, but something in his chest tightened, pulling him back. The weight of it, of the water, of the whispers, was unbearable. He couldn't breathe. "Alan, are you—" But Alan's head tilted to the side, his movements jerky and unnatural. He raised a hand, pointing toward the river, and then the first sound came. A low, guttural growl, too deep to be human, too monstrous to be anything alive. The figure of Alan began to sway, his limbs twitching, the water beneath his feet rising higher, flooding into the ground around him. And then, Sutherland saw it, the reflection. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the mist, something in the fog that warped his vision. But as his eyes adjusted, the shape became clearer. The figure in the water was not just Alan, it was something else, something more. The reflection was distorted, its limbs stretching unnaturally, as if the water itself was pulling it into the depths. And then, Sutherland realized that the reflection wasn't just mimicking Alan. It was consuming him, pulling him into the depths, bending his form, twisting it into something unrecognizable. Alan's face, twisted in a mocking grin, began to melt, to disintegrate, as if the water itself were tearing him apart. Sutherland stumbled backward, his mind racing. He didn't know what was happening, only that the river, the tide water, had changed them. It had taken them, twisted them into things that no longer resembled the people they had once been. He couldn't stay here. He had to keep moving. He had to survive. But even as he turned, the ground beneath him seemed to give way. The mist was swirling around his feet now, filling his vision with a thick, suffocating cloud. The water surged, crawling across the ground like a living thing, climbing up the trees, reaching out toward him, pulling him back. "You cannot escape," came the voice again, the voice of the river, the voice of the tide water. It was a low, soothing whisper now, like a lullaby, a song sung to pull him into the water. "You are part of us, forever." Sutherland's hands shook as he tried to push forward, but the weight of the river's voice was too strong. He could feel it pulling at him, tugging at his very soul, draining the will to fight from him. His heart was a drumbeat in his chest, but the blood was slowing, thickening in his veins. The ground beneath his feet was softening, becoming liquid, the earth turning to water, the river pulling it all into its depths. "Join us." The voice was everywhere, inside his head, in his ears, in his blood. It was the river. It was the forest. It was the very land, and it knew him. It had always known him. It had always watched him. But just as the pull of the river grew too strong to resist, just as the mist enveloped him, he saw it. Something in the water, something that made his heart freeze in his chest. There, at the edge of the trees, something was moving. It was Sarah. Her face, pale and twisted, stared out from the mist. Her eyes were empty, hollow, the same as the others, the same as Alan. Her lips curled into that grotesque, unholy grin that was too wide, too mocking. "Come back," she whispered, her voice a hollow echo. "We're waiting for you." Sutherland's legs buckled beneath him. His body was no longer his own. The weight of the water, the weight of the voices, it was too much. The river's grip was too strong. It was pulling him under, pulling him into its endless depths. And then, just as his vision began to fade into darkness, one thought pierced his mind like a sharp knife. There is no escaping the river. Not now, not ever. The last thread of light in Sutherland's eyes began to dim. swallowed by the thick, oppressive darkness of the forest and the relentless pull of the river. He felt his body sinking, the weight of the water pressing against him, dragging him deeper into the murk where the surface of reality itself seemed to break apart. The whispers, those same voices, Sarah's, Marcus's, Alan's, were now one, blending into a single, unholy chant that echoed through his mind, reverberating with the pulse of the river, pulling him into the depths. But there was something else, something that cut through the rising panic, something that made his blood run cold. The forest had stopped moving. For a fleeting moment, the whispers quieted, as if the very air had held its breath. A shadow stretched across the land, darkening the once dappled forest floor. It wasn't a shadow of clouds or trees. It was something older, something deeper. The light seemed to warp around him, bending toward the water, as if everything was turning toward the river. And then, like the breath after a scream, everything shifted. Suddenly, there was no more forest. Sutherland's eyes snapped open. The oppressive weight of the earth was gone. The ground beneath his feet had disappeared, and he was floating. Floating in stillness. Floating on the surface of the river, where the water was eerily calm again. Too calm. The voices had stopped. He couldn't move. His limbs felt numb, unresponsive. The once frantic urgency was now replaced with a strange, unsettling stillness. His head was heavy, as if something was pressing against it, pulling him under the water, as if the very river was waiting for him to succumb. The world around him was blurred, muted, as though seen through the ripples of the river's surface. And there, beyond the mist that hung heavily in the air, he could just make out shapes, figures, tall and twisted, standing at the water's edge. They weren't human anymore. Sarah, Alan, Marcus. They stood there, or something that looked like them stood there. Their forms were stretched, distorted, their eyes dark and hollow, their mouths frozen in that same grotesque smile. Their bodies jerked unnaturally, as if moved by some invisible current beneath the surface. The river was shaping them, remaking them into something else, something terrible. They stared at him, their expressions blank, unfeeling. The look in their eyes sent a chill through his chest. They were no longer alive. The river had claimed them, twisted them into its own reflection, and then, as Sutherland's mind reeled, a voice broke through the silence. A familiar voice, but not his own. It was the voice of the river, deep, ancient, and patient. "You're here. You've finally come home," the voice whispered, reverberating through his mind, curling in his thoughts like a cold serpent. "You've always belonged here, Sutherland. The river knows your name. You are one of us now." His blood turned to ice. The words felt like a weight, like chains tightening around his chest. His heart raced, his breath shallow, but his body wouldn't obey. His limbs floated helplessly on the surface of the water. He was still in the river, still in its grasp. The voices had returned, growing louder, becoming one in his head. He was drowning in them, drowning in the water. "No! No!" he gasped, his mind screaming. His body, so weak, so unwilling, tried to move, tried to break free. But there was no escape. The river was everywhere. The earth had vanished. The sky had dissolved into the endless mist of the water. There was no more forest, no more land to run to. All that existed was the river. And it had claimed him. But the voice of the river, it knew him. "The river is your home now, Sutherland. The forest, the land, they are nothing. We have waited so long for you. You are part of us. And now you will join us." The whispers turned into laughter, a terrible hollow sound that rose from the depths of the river, growing louder, deafening. Sutherland's mind raced. He had seen it before. He had seen what the river did to the others, how it twisted them, how it made them part of it. He was no different. He was already lost. But even in that moment of despair, something within him stirred. A flicker of defiance, a pulse of life that refused to fade. He tried to pull himself together, to rise from the depths, to break free from the river's grip. But the weight of it was suffocating. The voices grew louder, pressing against him from all directions. He felt himself sinking deeper. But then, something changed. The figures at the water's edge, the others, began to move, slowly, deliberately. They walked into the water, their forms jerking unnaturally as though the very current was pulling them toward the river's heart. Sutherland's breath caught as he saw them closer now, their bodies twisted beyond recognition, their movements mechanical, lifeless. It was the river controlling them, shaping them into something new. He looked at them with a mixture of horror and pity. They were lost, gone. There was no saving them now. But then something even worse happened. As the figures moved deeper into the water, they began to sink. They weren't drowning. They were melting, sinking into the depths, their bodies twisting and warping as if they were being consumed by the river itself. Their forms dissolved, disappearing into the water like shadows, leaving nothing but the faintest ripple on the surface. Sutherland's heart beat faster. They were gone. They had been claimed, just like the legend said. The river didn't just take them, it transformed them, and now it was waiting for him. He was next. The water surged around him, pulling him deeper into its depths, twisting and shifting as if the very current was alive, feeding on his fear, pulling at his body, at his soul. "Join us," the voice whispered again, now so close. It was like it was inside his skull. "You are one of us now, Sutherland." The voices, all of them, grew louder, their laughter echoing through his mind, vibrating in his bones. He couldn't escape. He couldn't run. His body felt weightless, numb. He was sinking, falling into the river's embrace. He had been marked, long ago. The river knew his name. The last thing he saw before the water closed over him was the reflection of his own face in the water, twisted, warped into that same hideous grin. And then there was nothing. The river held Sutherland, its cold embrace pulling him further into the depths. It wasn't like drowning. No, this was different. This was something more insidious, more intimate. The water didn't swallow him with force. It welcomed him, wrapped around him like an ancient, suffocating embrace. Every inch of his skin felt as though it were being drawn into the earth itself. His body no longer felt his own. It was as if the river had taken him entirely, remaking him, pulling him apart piece by piece. But even as he sank deeper, as the surface of the water above him began to fade into a faint glimmer of light, something within him stirred. It wasn't physical, it was mental, like a wave that broke against the tide, a sharp edge to his thoughts amidst the haze of the river's grip. He wasn't sure if it was his mind rebelling against the inevitable, or if something else was trying to awaken within him. Something was trying to reach him, and that was when it came. The first thing he heard was the whisper of his name, soft but insistent. A voice not from the river, not from the depths, but from something else. It was a voice he hadn't heard in what felt like forever. Sutherland. His eyes fluttered open. No, not eyes. He didn't know if they were even his anymore. But he saw it. Saw her. Sarah. Her figure stood at the water's edge. She was different. Her once pale skin had taken on an eerie, almost spectral quality, glowing faintly beneath the water, like the river had claimed every part of her body, her soul. But there was something more to her, something unfamiliar, something ancient. The same twisted grin from before still haunted her face, but it wasn't a smile anymore. It was something darker, something that felt like a trap. Her eyes weren't the same. They were black, pitch dark, the pupils swallowed by shadows, and they were looking at him. Not just at him, but through him. "Sarah," he whispered, barely able to find his voice. "Sarah, what happened to you? What's happening to all of us?" Her lips didn't move, but her voice came again, clearer, now rising from the depths of the river, speaking to him without words. It was an ancient, otherworldly presence that filled his mind, a presence that seemed to pulse through the water, through the earth itself. "It is not your fault," the voice whispered. "You never had a chance. You were always meant to come here, to be part of us, to be part of it. The river has been waiting for you, for all of you." He felt his heart race in his chest. His mind was screaming in rebellion, but his body was locked in place. It was as if he could hear the very pulse of the river, beating in time with his heart, drawing him deeper. He tried to move, tried to wake up, but the water held him fast. Who are you?" His words were weak, but the question came from somewhere deep inside him, somewhere buried beneath the panic. Sarah's form shimmered, becoming more translucent with each passing second. She stepped into the water, her movements unnatural, fluid, like the river itself was guiding her. The grin on her face twisted, and then from deep within her voice came the answer, not from her, but from the river itself. "We are the river's children, the tidewater. The river is us, and we are the river. We are its voice, we are its hands, and you have always belonged here." The world around Sutherland began to warp. The trees that once stood on the riverbank twisted and bent, their bow, branches reaching out as though they too had been taken by the river, turned into something else. The very land seemed to shift beneath him, becoming a dark, endless expanse of water that stretched infinitely beyond the horizon, beyond the mind's understanding. And then the full revelation hit him. It wasn't just the river that had taken them. It was the land itself. The forest, the mountains, the very earth around them, all of it was part of this ancient living thing. The tidewater wasn't a river. It was the land, the earth itself, an ancient, all-consuming force that had waited for centuries, feeding on those who wandered too far into its domain. Those who thought they could conquer the wild. Those who thought they could control it. And now it was taking him. The voices were becoming clearer, sharper. He could hear them, all of the lost souls who had come before him, each of them part of the river's eternal hunger, each one a thread in the tapestry of the tidewater, and he was the last thread. "No," Sutherland screamed, but it was no use. His words were swallowed by the water, by the endless, suffocating flood of voices. He was being pulled deeper still, the surface of the water above him growing distant, fading like the last breath of someone already gone. "You will join us," Sarah's voice echoed in his mind, the words not her own, but the river's. "We are one now." And then it happened. The river, the land, the spirit, it all became him. Sutherland was no longer just a man. He was part of the tidewater. The water filled his lungs, but he didn't drown. He became the river. He could feel its pulse, its hunger, its eternal weight. His limbs were no longer his own, but extended into the water, becoming part of the dark, rippling surface. He could feel the pull of every lost soul beneath him, their whispers mingling with his thoughts. He was no longer human. And then, in the iron final moment before his thoughts dissolved completely into the river's embrace, he understood. The river had always known his name. It had always been waiting. And now, he was part of it. The last vestiges of Sutherland's humanity dissolved beneath the water, leaving only the river, the tide water, to claim him fully. His mind no longer clung to his past, to the terror, to the desperate fight for freedom. His thoughts mingled with the river's currents, becoming one with its ancient, relentless hunger. Time itself seemed to bend and twist, stretching into a place beyond reason, beyond understanding. He was no longer Sutherland. He was the river, the land, the spirit that pulsed beneath the surface. His body no longer existed, just the cool, dark water that stretched infinitely, moving like a living thing beneath the earth. The whispers that had filled his mind before now became his voice, his thoughts. He could feel the lost souls of those who had come before him, those who had been claimed by the river. They whispered in unison, their voices a chorus of longing, of hunger, of eternity. They were waiting, always waiting. And then, with a shuddering pull, Sutherland realized something even more profound. The river wasn't just a force that took. It was a force that became. It didn't just consume, it reshaped. The land, the riverbanks, the trees, they were all part of the river. The water was alive, breathing, twisting the world around it into something new, something dark and eternal. It was a cycle, a web of souls, and Sutherland was now the newest thread in that endless tapestry. But there was one thing, one thought that still lingered in his consciousness, an echo from the man he once was. A single question, deep and aching. Why had the river chosen them? Why had it taken Sarah, Marcus, Alan, and the others only to claim him now, to reshape him into something else? What was its purpose? What was the ultimate end? The answer came, not from his own thoughts, but from the very water itself. It wasn't a voice. It was a feeling, an overwhelming understanding that filled every inch of his being. The river didn't choose. It waited. It waited for the lost. It waited for the ones who strayed too far, the ones who thought they could conquer its depths, the ones who thought they could master the wild. And when they came, when the river had marked them, when the land had claimed them, it shaped them into its own, there was no escape. There had never been an escape. It wasn't just the souls of the lost that now filled the water. It was the land itself. The very soil, the trees, the rocks, everything was part of the tidewater. Everything had always been. And now, Sutherland was part of it. He was the river, just as the river was him. Together they were one. Together they would never end. The cycle had begun long before him, and it would continue long after. The river stretched endlessly before him. The once familiar forest, the once solid ground, was no longer anything but a distant memory, swallowed by the water's depths. The air was thick with mist, the kind that only a place like this could produce, unnatural, suffocating. The voices of those who had come before him still echoed, but now they felt different. They felt like his voices, his own thoughts, his own desires, were lost within the great eternal current of the river. As Sutherland's consciousness fully merged with the tidewater, something remarkable happened. The world around him began to shift. The land didn't just disappear, it was remade. The river pushed out from its banks, rising up, flooding over the once familiar forest, washing away the old earth, reshaping it, turning the trees into twisted, gnarled forms. The river expanded, carving new paths, bending the world to its will. The creatures of the forest, no longer living, no longer truly anything, rose from the depths, formed from the very water itself. The trees became skeletal hands that reached toward the sky, their twisted limbs grasping at the air. The entire world was bending, folding, becoming part of the river. There was no place left untouched.
Sutherland felt the pull of the tidewater. He could feel it in the very depths of his soul. The river was no longer just a body of water. It was the land, the sky, the air, the breath of the earth. It was alive. It had always been alive. And now he was part of it. He could feel the pull of others. Those who had crossed its path before. Those who had dared to stand on its banks. Those who had fallen victim to its whispers. They were out there, trapped in their own eternal cycle, waiting for someone else to join them, to take the path they had once walked, to become part of the tidewater. And as Sutherland drifted deeper into the heart of the river, as his form merged with the shifting, ever-changing currents, he understood it all. The river knew their names, it always had, and now it was waiting for the next.